And then before that was at Salem Presbyterian in Limestone at Washington College Academy there.
Okay.
I was there 40 years. So we've been here.
Are you from that? Like
No. Just moved here in 2001, and we just kind of settled here and fell in love with the area.
We came in 2010.
Okay.
Thinking that we'll be here a year. We'll move.
Yeah.
We should probably not ready. Like we're getting in school. We're going to be gone within it. Turns out.
So how's your semester going at Tusculum?
This semester actually went really well.
Okay.
I'm sure. But the spring semester was the worst I've ever had.
Really?
I was ready to just like here's the destination. I'm done. But this has been a great group, and that's completely my demeanor is much better now. I'm sure I'll have to tell you.
So I'm sure you're doing a freshman level course or two. What's your
No,
kind of senior level course?
I do.
Oh, really?
God bless you.
101 and 102s, and so none of them. Well, this group is good, but none of them usually want to be in there, and so they have to take a course, and they're not interested in the course, and you have to do like the dog and pony show and get them to do something that's interesting, and they couldn't care less. But we have such a small group, we don't even have a major, so I don't get to teach a lot of upper level classes.
There's no religion major there?
There's no.
Really?
So we have a minor, and like we have one. I get to teach one elective a year. And I'm doing more right now actually. That's a good class, but yeah, it's not always enjoyable.
That's really interesting. I mean, small liberal arts Presbyterian affiliated college.
They used to have one. And I don't know, it was before I was there. They got rid of it, and I pushed early on, and they said no.
Recording in progress.
It's not worth the money. And
No, that's me. Sorry, go ahead.
But anyway, they just never did implement it because I guess you don't have enough faculty. I'm the only one that's religion there. Our new president, I can see him wanting that, but he's very much pushing it toward the right. He's wanting to push it. Parson Newman is kind of because he's so Baptist.
And that's the president. Because I met the new chaplain there, I think, who's also Baptist,
also
right?
Baptist.
Yeah.
Baptist too, yes. And so we're getting this, push.
Until the invention of
I made copies. I made 40 copies of this. 5 of these because the printer jammed up and I couldn't finish. But
Go make some more in just a second.
Everybody.
Or if we need to. I'm just gonna aim that
You
out.
guys are really high tech and. But if I can. Having Apple equipment, Mac stuff, usually I get Windows and can you change it to a PowerPoint for me? And it usually messes up.
And I used to work in Linux and like server side stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what Mac runs on. It's so much easier for me to.
How to use a PC, really. My wife asked me for help and I said, I don't know.
Yeah, anytime I have to do anything with a PC, it takes. To this Zoom meeting, if you can join that and then share your screen, I think that means everybody else.
On a Presbyterian.
You've been at Tusculum 13 years now?
Let's see, I started in 10 I was an.
I mean, time flies by, but I remember when the announcement, when you came, I remember the first theologian.
My oldest, who wasn't in school then.
Recording in progress.
All right, now if you'll mute your Zoom. Pick up. And probably immediately turn off. Is it okay?
HDMI.
I bet that's what I do. First.
Please leave your message.
Your laptop. Your Zoom is muted, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out where we're getting that echo.
Oh, never mind. I thought that
You got a theory on
was-
it?
No, when you did that, I thought it was stopping.
It's still saying only you can.
Would it have something to do? Like when I share the screen.
Yeah, see if you can not share sound. Let's see if that does that. Shared content is not.
I guess that's not. Yeah, it is strange.
Test, test. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Scott. We're getting. I wanted to see if you could see his presentation.
All right, I see, I just see the back of someone. I'm gonna go ahead and mute this, so I could hear you.
Dr. Williams, I'm Ginger. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
We're so appreciative of you coming.
Well, glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
15 minutes, 20. You kind of tell me what you've got to go and get done. We can.
Is there a way to?
Whatever you want to.
Be like 2 10-minute breaks?
Sure, we can do whatever you want to.
Because I've got, since we're at kind of 3 hours, we're at.
So there's cognitive on phase 1 and cognitive on phase 2.
Right.
Okay, well, you tell me what time you want to take a break and we'll do it.
It will.
Say we're going to take a break now. That's fine with me.
Okay, well, I've got it like planned in here actually.
Okay,
I'll show you.
good clue.
So, I'll remember. Did that actually work, Brian?
Yeah, I think I figured out the reverb.
That sounds
two
great
times.
to me.
Yeah.
One of the breaks will allow them to get some refreshments and bring them back in here.
Okay.
So, yeah. And you're in good hands with Brian for sure.
I am.
And I'm grateful for him being here because this is not my forte. All right, well, great. Yeah. It's been interesting and exciting. I keep hearing people. Those come, it's like, well,
Really?
that's really good.
Wow.
You know, we send it out to the Presbyterian here in a few, but you never know. People wake up in the morning and it's like. So glad. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. You got the volume, just not the sharing part. Is that what you're working on?
Yeah, the volume I figured out, we had another system running. Correctly. Doc, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you and the echo is gone.
He unmuted.
I can hear you and the echo is gone.
Hi, but you don't see the screen share, do you?
Now I got the echo back again.
I turned off I unmuted myself. But you don't see.
From this side, I see media streaming. I see Travis Williams, Brian Wyatt, but it's just blank. I don't see your video connected, and Kelly McBee. I show those four, and then of course mine, but I don't see the actual content of your screen that you're sharing.
Screen share. He is screen share. It pops up a message. You see at the top right there, David?
Yeah, I'm reading it. Your shared screen can only be seen by the host. The limitation that is on your role,
It's on his
role, yeah, his assignment within the Zoom.
to,
Yes, under participants,
yep.
I think. How you
Make
doing?
him-
Good, how are you?
There we go. That's it, Brian.
Oh, it says participants can now see your screen, but okay.
well, never-
Either way.
never.
No, you got it. Thank you, David. That did it. Give
Brian,
me a thumbs
yeah,
up.
There they go.
See the screen share now.
yes, I see it all.
Scott.
Yes, Brian.
Okay. We've got. Or I'm sorry, sound you didn't hear it. I don't see that. Okay. Kelly, if you're still there, can you hear me now? Sound is fine on her end. Okay. Hear you if there are questions. Please. See, that took out the echo. Can you say anything, Kelly, and so let us see if we can hear you?
Yes, I'm in Castlewood, Virginia, and really happy that I didn't have to get up and get to
And
West.
so glad to have you from Virginia this morning. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, I think we got everything resolved. Thank you.
Okay.
At this point,
No, I'm good.
and you want some extra copies of that, or you other thing you just want to hold off?
We can, I wouldn't give that to the end anyway, so
Okay,
we'll.
that's-
How you been, Bill?
Hey, how are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Have all these great things. Any copies out here?
I think it's a lot.
But this is gonna be so interesting. I won't
You
need
won't
to,
need
I won't
copies.
need, this. Yeah, this will eat me away.
What's that? Oh.
Still work.
Those new, like into type balloons. We got. Not 10 years, I think, but
Yeah, well, I'm 8.5. So much. And I have a.
I just got a new iPad this year, and I got the larger screen, which helps us in the morning. Yeah. Which I know is twice what you pay for Windows, but still, it's, I mean, if you get kind of.
I have a service. So. Do that. It's okay. It's run.
Morning. How are you all?
Very good. How about you?
Wonderful.
Great. Go ahead. Everything.
You guys smell coffee? They said they had some in the back.
One, like the, the one in 2020 of the.
Mine is. There's gonna be the. Battery needs to be replaced.
Hardware and software, to put the software on a chip. Because, I mean, order it of magnitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've got it. Too, because we have. That's right. I'll even use it at all. In this area right here.
I will be.
Yes, thank you.
In here.
This is a couple of.
I remember having a conversation.
A decade ago.
That's the way they get back. Say where.
The one tribe was one. what I use.
Yeah.
We're
Definitely will do that.
It didn't change, but.
Oh, you all go here?
We're just over several spots.
It's pretty good already. It's ready. Okay. So that probably got there. Was available.
And we'll-
The bathroom called me and said, "Oh, this guy."
I don't know.
Here in the church.
Well, hopefully it's,
Hopefully, even though they're obviously online.
Yeah.
for it.
I had a painless father. I'm ready to hear. Yeah.
here's something else.
Sure. Here's the way you think. Right. Yeah.
It's really interesting. The weather changed a lot as far as understanding
Good morning.
their world, their, what things were done and stuff. Processing a lot of this stuff because even though they were discovered in the 40s,
I think she said a whole bunch.
they sat and no one saw them and stuff around it. The Catholic churches, the Pope's trying to cover this up because it was just incompetence by the scholars that had it. It was only in 2000 that they were all published. Had access to them. So in the last 20 years or so. And the nice thing about now is we have everything online now. It's all free. You can read everything, and so which is picture on.
Hey, how always so good to see you there, lady. Thank you, thank you. Oh,
Yeah, I think.
What? The youngest?
You're probably the youngest.
I just had a
What? Okay. Let's see. How are you? The coffee ready? How are you? And it's is that really that? Would you like a cup of coffee, sir? How are you?
oh no, thank you.
In a way of that was not good.
Oh, it's all right.
How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you doing?
Williams, good to have you with
Well,
us.
thank you. Thank you for
Yeah.
having.
She became a teenager. I wondered one. Yes. What happened, dear?
Graceful birdie broke a bone in each.
It'll get you.
No, little.
Can all those people see that?
There's one. I'm not really sure, honestly.
That is real tricky right there. Be careful.
Oh, I'm right.
Probably internet, it's on the right side of there.
See.
Thank you very much. Sure.
Right. That's right. It is good. It is good. Good.
Good morning.
Similar. So you're still. You have. You know, and we go on there.
That's probably that's
You know, it's like. That is this.
Right there, that. Crazy, that's expression. That's what you're doing.
The bathrooms are in Everyone. Good morning. How's everybody this morning? Excited to have this. I'm going to invite Ginger to welcome our speaker this morning in just a moment, but I just want to. We're delighted we could have this morning. We're going to take a couple of breaks this morning, but anytime you need to get up, there's some. Through either door and make your way kind of toward the back of the church directly behind us. There's bathrooms on either side underneath the stairs. So please just make yourself at. If you go here, raise your hand. Find any of these people with their hands up and we'll be happy to kind of help you find whatever you need.
Yeah. We're pleased to have Dr. Travis Williams come today to make this presentation on the Dead Sea. He's written a book, he's co-edited books, so I think he's very scholarly, and we just a short reading. And this is a quote by Dr. Penelope Corfield.
Why on earth does it matter what happened long ago? The answer is that history is inescapable. It studies the past subject. It connects things through time and encourages its students to take a long view of such connections. Take a few obvious examples. Communities speak languages that are inherited from the past. They live in society been created on the spur of a moment. People use technologies that they have not themselves invented. Absolutely basic for a good understanding of the condition of being human. That, in a nutshell, is why history.
Thank you, Ginger. All right, can everyone hear me in the back? You all, can you hear okay? I can yell louder. Thank you all for being here. This is a great crowd. How many of you again are from this church to here? And then I guess those who are raising your hand. So we have some from all around. Where are we from? Who's today? I'm just curious. Some you said Kingsport, right? Johnson City, Kingsport, Jonesboro, Unicoi. Abingdon. Okay, wow. Out of state even. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. I'm out of Greenville. I've been at Tusculum for, it's been 12 years now, teaching there. I am not the world leading expert of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I will tell you that up front. I've written a few books on the subject, but there are many who know much more about it than I do. But this is a subject that I love to discuss because it is fascinating.
What religious affiliation is Tusculum College?
Is Tusculum. Tusculum is by history a Presbyterian school. That's the affiliation that we have. So we're kind of loosely affiliated more recently, but yes, Presbyterian. But what we'll do is I've got 3 different things that we'll discuss this morning, and we'll go through the topics. We'll take 2 breaks. So if you have questions, if you have like a burning question that's in the middle of it, go ahead and raise your hand. But it kind of gets us off track if we stop in the middle. So I'll pause at 2 big points or at the end as well for questions. So if you have questions, maybe write them down. But if you can't, if you're going to forget it, just go ahead and ask it. That's fine too. So the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as you might have seen from the advertisement, if you read that, or maybe in the radio, I don't know what on the radio, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are considered by many to be one of, if not the biggest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. This was huge. This was earth shaking. And what I find though, and I go around to different places, lots of different places, and speak on this subject because people are interested. What I find is a lot of people realize and recognize, hey, these things are important. We know that we probably should know something about them. They are significant. But as far as what they are and why they're significant, I've discovered that a lot of people are unsure. They know a few things, but the biggie, some of the big things, and part of the reason I was just discussing with these folks over here, part of the reason is because honestly, scholars are just beginning to understand the implications. These things, as you'll see in a second, were discovered in the 40s, but they weren't actually published until the 1990s. And that wasn't because of a conspiracy, but because of incompetence. And they didn't become completely public until 2000, and they were all out in print. Today, you can read all of them if you want. But since 2000, we finally had the whole corpus. And that means since 2000, that's when we've begun to understand and think through some of the issues that are raised in the scroll. So what we're going to do this morning is look at 3 things. So discussing the importance, the implications of the scroll. The first thing we're going to look at is the discovery and content. So what is actually in the scrolls? What are they? How are they discovered? All of that we'll spend the first half or the first part of this morning. The second part that we're going to look at is how do the scrolls help us understand the text of the Bible? So we have modern English Bibles that we would use in church, let's say. How have the scrolls shaped how we think about that text? Specifically, do we have now in our Bibles what they wrote back then? How do the scrolls help us answer that question? And that's one of the more interesting topics that we'll look at. And then finally, how do the scrolls help us understand Jesus better? Because they do. Now, none of the scrolls are Christian scrolls. They weren't written by Christians. Christianity wasn't around yet and started. But they have huge implications for how we understand Jesus or Paul or the New Testament. And so we'll look at some of that. So we'll start with the definition. Here's my definition of the scrolls. What we have in the scroll is a collection of over 900 Jewish texts. Now, many of them are fragmentary. I'll show you that in a second. But 900 Jewish documents are represented in this, in possibly a library. Many think it's a library. There's debate about that. But over 900 documents dating from the 3rd century BC, so before Jesus and Christianity, to the 1st century AD. So it's a pretty big span of how far these texts date. And they were discovered 1947. Up through 1956. So we're a 10-year window. It took a long time because there were 11 different caves they were discovered in at a place called Qumran. Now, we're going to look at the first part at Qumran. Has anybody ever been to Qumran? I'm just curious. You've been to Israel and visited? Okay. So some of you know. So here, if you're not familiar with it, Qumran is on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. So here's the Dead Sea, just east of Jerusalem. There's a little settlement there. And what you find, here's what it looks like today. Up above, there's a settlement here. This is the ancient settlement of Qumran, here back Qumran. And back here is the visitor center. But there are also caves. There are caves that kind of scattered up for like actually a mile or so. You can see the Dead Sea in the background. And here's what this settlement would have looked like in the 1st century. So when Jesus is around, this is what it would look like. You see, and archaeologists have identified a few things. So you have the potter's kiln. There's a dining hall, this long area where they probably got together and ate, possibly, and other things. There's a scriptorium, and this is debated now. Is this a place where some of these books were written? Possibly. Possibly copying going on. There's some debate there too. There are ritual baths all over, mikvah or mikvah, all over this place. There are huge numbers of them. And we'll look at why, because of this community's really strict adherence to rituals and maintaining purity. But this is why. So here are some of the caves. Notice you'll see here back here, you can see the caves in the background. Some of the people who lived here, and they possibly lived in the caves too, but there was a walking path between the caves and the settlement. But in these caves is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And there were different numbers discovered at different caves. You can see here's cave 8, 7, 9. 4 was the biggie, but this is just right below that settlement. You can see that's the location wise. This is what we're dealing with. Now, the second part is the discovery. Now, the discovery story of the scrolls is what makes them, I think, so fascinating. The way that we came about these things, and even why were they there to be discovered in the first place, is I found fascinating. And so I want to show you this video first. So here is the story of how these came about to us. Yes. We were working on this for a while this morning. So it worked earlier. Let's see. Share screen. Share.
The transition was beautiful.
This makes it even more fascinating. Not only the discovery, but also, did you notice the copper scroll, this treasure map? It was literally a scroll made out of copper that they discovered. They stretched it out, or they couldn't. They cut it in parts. But if it stretched all the way out, all it had was coordinates. You walk to this, stand at this tree, walk 10 paces, turn left, and dig down 5 feet, and there's this much treasure. And this fascinated people, obviously, and many went to look for the treasure and never found it. But let's come back to the early discovery first before we get into that. So here is the first cave. This is where the first batch of scrolls were first discovered. Now, this has been dug out by archaeologists since the bottom part here and this part of here. All it was at first was this small little hole. And actually, they said at first It was the size big enough for maybe a cat to come through. And can you imagine that you see this little hole and somebody decides to jump in there and you don't know what's in there, an animal or who knows how far down it goes. But once these Bedouin are looking around, they find this. One jumps in, and this is what they get. So this is the initial discovery. There are 3 scrolls discovered. So one was a complete copy of Isaiah. This is the one you saw in the video where in the Shrine of the Book Museum, it's stretched out all the way around in that big encasement. That's it. It's the complete copy of the book we have as Isaiah. 2, there's a community rule. This is kind of instructions for a particular really conservative Jewish group, probably the group who lived at Qumran or resided there. That was their headquarters. How do you take part in their group? How you join their group? What are the regulations? How you live? And it was very, very strict. 3 is what we call Pesher Habakkuk. This is the earliest commentary on the Bible that had ever been discovered. It was a commentary on the book of Habakkuk. And we're going to discuss that more in just a second. Now, once they discover these texts, they don't know what they have, first of all. Did you notice what they did with them when they found them? They couldn't read them. Even scholars at first could not read them. They didn't know what they were, because Hebrew, the fonts had changed. And so it took a while to figure out what this is, because we didn't have text this old. And so we have to adjust. But they didn't know what they had. They hung it on a tent pole on their camp. And actually, we have stories of what happened next. Some of the kids, as these texts were just sitting there for weeks, some of the kids actually in the camp took one out and was playing with it. They were kicking it around the camp and like playing soccer with it. And one of the moms actually got so fed up with it, they're making so much racket, she took it out and just tossed it into the wind. We have no clue where it was, what it was. Only after they realized how much these things are worth, they went to look for it and it was gone. So who knows what it could have been? It could have been something else. It's just as groundbreaking. But eventually they sell them. Did you notice how much they sold it for? $4. $4 of this thing, and even the 40s. I mean, that's not great. These things are worth millions upon millions of dollars. Even I don't know if you saw the story a couple of years ago. The owner of Hobby Lobby purchased a few little scraps, little fragments of the scrolls, which turned out to be fakes. But he paid millions of dollars for these things. These are precious, and so once they realized we have something here, they went back. Now, and some will say they went back to the same cave. Some think they discovered a different cave. But either way, they get 4 more. So we're up to 7 now. So this is number 4. They found another copy of Isaiah. Now, this wasn't as full. It wasn't a complete copy like the first one, but it was still quite complete. 2 is they found a war scroll. Now, this is, if you're familiar with the book of Revelation, this is end time Armageddon kind of thing. It describes a battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and how God is going to send the angels to fight with the forces of good and defeat the evil, which at that time would have been the Romans too. And this is all end time. 3 are the Thanksgiving hymns. These are similar to our modern Psalms. It's just a book of Psalms or hymns. But they're interesting because some of them are written, scholars believe, by one of the leaders of the community. And so he describes himself as having this great ability. He's given revelation by God. He knows the mind of God in some cases. He's the only one who does. And he has this really exalted spot. And 4 is the Genesis Apocryphon. It's a retelling of stories in Genesis, like Noah and the flood. But it gives you other details that the Bible leaves out. And so it's a complete retelling with lots of other insertions and things added to the story. We had never seen any of the last 3 before this discovery. Now, once they realized they had something, once they showed this eventually to someone, and actually, interesting enough, the first time a scholar ever, once they gave it to a scholar, they said, "Here, we want to purchase this." The first time a scholar got his hands on this was actually the exact time that the United Nations was declaring Israel a state. The exact same day, he's listening to it on the radio as he's reading these scrolls for the first time. In his diary, he mentions how this is ironic that I'm reading texts that were written the last time we were a state. But once they realized that the value of these things, there was a race on. So the race between the Bedouin shepherds who know the area, who know where the caves are, and the scholars. And here's why this is important. The Bedouin found the better caves. Scholars found some, but the Bedouin found the better caves. And the Bedouin weren't always trained to know how to handle these texts, nor were they really concerned about handling them. And so, for example, once they realized I can get money out of these, you want to guess what they did? Let's say I find a scroll that's like this. And what do? Oh, yeah. Oh, I've got 2 scrolls now. Actually, no, 3. I've got 3 scrolls to sell you. And so the scholars had to say, listen, we will pay more money for the bigger ones. Don't rip them in 2. Don't, destroy. Please just give us the whole thing and not just parts of it. But that was the race to find these things. And before the Bedouin took them. And so the big jackpot point, this is the big discovery, was at a place called Qumran Cave 4. So Cave 4 was the jackpot. It was right down from that settlement. And this is where most of the scrolls were discovered. So 75% were discovered here. This is what the inside of the cave looks like. And when they were discovered, unlike the first cave had, I'm going to show you this later. The first cave had them like in these little jars, and they're wrapped up and bundled up and put that's also nice. In this cave, most of them were just dumped. It was just a quick, they were thrown there. Sometimes they maybe had stuff on walls, like hanging on walls, and piled up there, but most of them were just dumped on the ground. It was a quick move. And so that has caused scholars to think, what's going on here? Why are they just dumping a bunch of scrolls here when other ones you have to wrap them up in linen and put them in a vase? What's going on here? We'll come back to that in a second too. So this brings us to what actually is in there. What's in the scrolls? What is in this 900 documents? Now, I want to show you this too. This is, when I say 900, this was made for me by a student for an extra credit project. Here she made here's my jar, my scroll jar. But these scrolls were wrapped up. You have this, a wrap on them, a clasp. But this is this is backwards. This is about the size, roughly the size of an ancient scroll or book would have been. You can see how big this is. This is what it would look like if I had, let's say, the Genesis Apocrypha, the whole thing. And you would unroll this all the way out. Well, we only have just that one copy of Isaiah like this. It's the longest, it's the biggest of all. Most of the scrolls, if we get this much, we're happy. This is what we usually have. In some cases, it's this. This is all we have. And so when I say 900, it's not 900 little fragments, it's 900 documents. So if this was one book, this is one document. This is it. This is all we have in that book. In some cases, we have close to this, but not fully. But they all together add up to 900 original documents, with thousands and thousands of little fragments. And so, what's in there? Well, part of the text, most of the texts are what we call Jewish sectarian texts. So these are texts that belong to and are used primarily by one particular Jewish group, and really strict group. We call these the Essenes. Now, the Essenes are the ones that most identify the scrolls with. These are the ones that probably dwell at Qumran. They live there, plus other places as well. But they're the ones that had this library, possibly wrote some of this text. But they're the ones that collected them. They're the ones whose library we are reading. Now, what are some of the texts that they had that we had never, ever seen? Well, here are some of those books. These are the first time that scholars ever read these books. So we have mentioned the community rule, the Hodayot, the Thanksgiving hymns, Pesharim. We have the war scroll. So all of these texts, these are brand new. The first time scholars ever saw them was in 1947 and on. These were brand new. And I'm going to give you one example. I'm going to show you what they look like. So the Pesharim. The Pesharim are commentaries. They're commentaries on different books of the Bible, usually prophecies. But they're not like we would think of commentaries today. Like a scholar, I just finished a commentary this last year and it came out on 1 Peter. I was looking at the historical context, who's writing it, when, what's going on, that kind of thing. They're not interested in that. They're interested in how does this apply for us? And here's the background. They have and this group has a teacher. They call him a teacher of righteousness. This guy's fascinating. He's a kind of similar to the Jesus kind of character. They said, we have faith in this teacher. So they believe that the teacher of righteousness had been given special revelation by God. He is the only one who can understand the biblical text, the prophecies especially. He has the key to unlock the text that you and I would not have. And so what they believe is he would study the prophetic text of Isaiah and Habakkuk, and then God would come and illuminate him. He would illuminate his mind to unlock give him the key to unlock it. And so then he would share this information with his community. And the information, the interpretation of it wasn't probably what they would expect or anyone else would have expected. So here's what it looks like. In these texts, you'd have a quotation from scripture. So this is Habakkuk. Woe to the one who gets his friend drunk, pouring out his anger, making him drink, just to get a look at their holy days. And the holy days is actually a variant. It should be their nakedness, but they've changed it there. They quote scripture, but they don't tell you like, all right, Habakkuk is writing to, when the Babylonians are a threat and the nation of Judah is in danger. And no, that's not the issue. What he does, and they give an interpretation. Its interpretation refers to the wicked priest who pursued the teacher of righteousness, that's their guy, to destroy him in the heat of his anger at his place of exile. At the time set aside for repose of the Day of Atonement, he appeared to them to destroy them and to bring them to ruin on the fast day, the Sabbath intended for their repose. So what they're saying is this text up here that you see actually was meant to refer to our time. This is an event where our teacher was pursued by his enemy, the wicked priest, and he tried to come and actually kill him, and it didn't work. But they had this fallout. So what you get is when they read the Bible, they're not reading it saying, what's Habakkuk talking about over there? Actually, Habakkuk, he didn't even know it, by the way. Habakkuk is writing things down, thinking probably he's talking about Babylon. God is using him as this instrument to write down mysteries, and he has no clue. He didn't even understand it then. But what it means is this is talking about us. So if you read Habakkuk, you read Isaiah, you read the Psalms, they're all about us, or at least for them, that community, their time. That's an example of the kind of literature that you got among this collection. Two is we have texts from the Jewish Bible, or what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. We have copies of every single book of the Old Testament in this collection, except one, and that's Esther. There was no copy of Esther in the text, but in fact, there are multiple copies of most every single book. Many of them have 10, 20 copies of each book of the Bible. Now, what they show us, and we're gonna spend the whole time in this, so hold on. What they show us is the text of the Bible that they're reading at the time of Jesus, actually circulated in multiple forms. There wasn't just one form of the Bible. In fact, if you were Jesus, we know of at least 3 forms of the book of Exodus. So if Jesus wanted to read the 10 Commandments in Exodus, there were actually 3 different versions of this that he could have read. And 3 of them were discovered at Qumran. And so he could read this one, he could read that one, he could read this one. And we're going to talk about what that means. Some of them were much shorter, some of them much longer. The words were changed in some cases. The information changed. And so that's really significant, and we're going to spend time there in a second. 3 is we have a bunch of texts from what we call common Judaism. So these are texts that it's not the Bible, at least for Protestants, but it's texts that were used more widely, not just among this one group. These are texts like Tobit or Judith or First Enoch. In fact, has anybody ever heard of First Enoch before? Heard this? Okay, some of you, okay. First Enoch was an apocalyptic kind of book. It's this Enoch, this character in the Old Testament gets the revelation from God, gets taken up into heaven and seeing mysteries. Well, that was a hugely important book. It's actually quoted in the book of Jude and the New Testament, but it was hugely important at this time. And this community, this group, had more copies of that book than, let's say, the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. So what the scrolls show us is this. It shows us that when they say, if you ask them, what's in your Bible? Now that's anachronistic. They didn't have a Bible per se because they didn't have a book form yet. They had scrolls. But if you were to ask them, what's your scripture? Give me the books that are most important for you? They were going to say probably first Enoch is more important than Nehemiah or Joshua or Judges. That's where their authority lied. So we see not every Jewish person had the same view on what's Bible and what's not. It wasn't yet settled and hammered down. And then 4, we get fragments. So about 10% or 11% are just too fragmentary. We have no clue. We can't really identify. We don't know what's in there. They're just so small. They're this big, and we have one word on it, and we don't know what it says. So here's this is important. When the scrolls, and I have they were first discovered in 47, but they weren't actually published until 1991, or at least released. I won't say published, released in 1991. Why that long of a time? Well, it wasn't a conspiracy theory. It wasn't a conspiracy. Many thought that the Catholic Church, they said, was the Pope was covering this up because it disproved Jesus somehow. No, it was incompetence mostly, and not enough people working on the job. So imagine in Cave 4 alone, there were hundreds and thousands of fragments. Imagine if you found a puzzle with pieces this small. And they're books that you had never, ever seen before. It wasn't just Genesis 1 in the beginning. You don't know where this goes. You don't even know what it goes to. All you have, you can see this picture here. These are the fragments that they're dealing with. They put them out on tables, figuring out what goes with what. If you like puzzles, this was your ultimate challenge here. And it's some of the stories here are fascinating too, and hilarious, actually. These gentlemen here didn't have experience working with manuscripts like this. These are biblical scholars. So this is the first time they're working with it. And so we have pictures of them in some cases. In one case, they're holding a scroll in one hand and their cigarette in the other hand. Or like they're sitting at a table and they've got their cup of coffee, like sitting right beside the scroll. And it's like, come on, guys. But there's also example, you see that these are on glass. They're put under glass. Sometimes to put the things in the right space to make them line up, they would put Scotch tape behind them, like on the back, like taking. They weren't the best at preserving these things, but this is how they're working. So it took them a long time to get this done and put them back together again. Now, here's the question that we're going to kind of wrap up this first session with. And it's this: well, why were there so many ancient Jewish scrolls in caves in Roman Judea at the time of Jesus? Why put 900, a bunch of books? Just some cases dump them, some cases put them in these big jars and roll them up. Why? Why were they there? And this leads to the fascination, because that's the answer to that is just as interesting as who found them. And so here's the answer. Now, I want to kind of situate you, kind of help you temporally. So Jesus dying in about 30 AD, some will say 33, but let's just say 30 AD. He dies, he's crucified. After this, shortly after this, year, 2-3 years, the Apostle Paul, converts. He becomes a Jesus follower, and he writes all these letters to churches around the ancient Mediterranean. He dies in about the year 64 AD. I want to kind of give you a placement of where we're at time-wise. The Gospels, most believe, were written maybe starting in 70 AD. Some will put these later in the 2nd century as well, but the screen's only so big. So we have Gospels here, Paul's letters here. Well, when were the scrolls hidden? Well, something is happening right about here in the year 70 AD. Does anybody know what's happening in 70 AD in Jerusalem?
Destruction of the temple.
Destruction of the temple, exactly. You know where it's going. So what happens is there are Jewish rebels who don't like the fact that the Romans are ruling over them, the taxes, they're just sick of it. They're fed up with the Romans in general because the Romans control all of this area. Well, they rebel. The Romans send in tons and tons of troops, their legions, to quell this rebellion. They're killing, they're burning, they're pillaging. They're coming through Israel. Well, one of the places they stop is this little settlement here at Qumran. They hear of this, probably that they're coming, and many of them maybe go to Masada. We're going to come back to that. So the settlement at Qumran was destroyed, archaeologists say, around 68 AD. So 68 AD, this is when it was burned, destroyed. There are arrows that they found. So maybe somebody fought this. But when they hear about them coming, because it took them a while to get there, they hear about it. What do? start to hide your scrolls, right? This is your prize. This is your library. This is the biggest library around probably at the time. There might be one in Jerusalem too, but they're hiding these things away, possibly, wrapping them up really nicely. Okay, we got time, and putting them in vases, and you hide. Well, what happens when the Romans get there quicker than you expect? Maybe you just got to dump some things. You just take piles and just this cave 4, where all the scrolls were discovered, most of them, they were just dumped. So that's the closest one to the settlement. So maybe you just run in there, get them in there. When we get back, we'll come and get them in a second. Look, after the Romans were defeated, because, by the way, they were going to be defeated because they had, remember the text, the War Scroll? The War Scroll said the end of time. This is Armageddon. This is like forces of good and evil. They're expecting God to win. And then the Romans moved further on Jerusalem. This is when they destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple. And then they moved to Masada. So in 74, and this is where many think that some of the people from Qumran moved to Masada, possibly, and held out there with them, because there was one text discovered there from Qumran. And then, of course, they died too. But here is the story. Here is possibly the reconstruction of, I like the language they use, an inadvertent time capsule. So these scroll owners, at least, maybe authors in some cases, they leave these scrolls, they dump them, they hide them there, thinking this is the end. This is when God's massive Armageddon kind of war is going to happen. We're part of the good, obviously, and the Romans are the bad. The angels are going to come and fight for us, and they lost. And most of them probably die. After this, as the video said, we don't hear of these scenes again. They're not heard from in their writings, their history. No one talks about them. This is it for them. And whoever knew about the hiding of these scrolls, they were definitely killed because they didn't come back for them. They were just left there for 2,000 years until somebody goes and throws some rocks around. And that's what I find fascinating, especially when I think about, is there anything else like that? Because the year before that, by the way, the year before 47, that's when a set of Christian texts, the Nag Hammadi texts, you've heard of those? The Gnostics? Those texts were discovered 1 year earlier. And so right around the same time. But it makes me wonder, is there something else? Is there something else waiting? Maybe there's going to be an earthquake or something happens and it knocks loose some rocks and we see something we haven't seen in a long time. But who knows? These have changed everything as far as ancient Judaism, Christianity, how we view them. And there still might be something else out there that's going to change it even more. But we don't know. All right. So that's the first half. We're going to take a break now. If you want, we'll take about a 10-minute break or so. If you need to go stretch, if you need to go to the restroom, if you get some more coffee, whatever, we'll come back in about 10 minutes and pick up on the text of the Bible. If you have questions you want to ask at this time, feel free to do that as well.
I have a question.
Okay.
Is there any plan, or is it possible to photograph all those fragments and put them in a computer and let AI piece them together?
Well, yes. They are all electronic. They're online. They're digital now, since 2000 something. So all of them can be viewed electronically for free, and they have used AI to help in that process. And actually, AI now is being used. I have a friend in the Netherlands. He's got a project called The Hands That Wrote the Bible, but he's using AI to determine who wrote this one, handwriting styles, and who wrote this, and to see how many scribes are being used. Is this the same person? Can we link up text that we didn't link before? And so, so a lot of that work is being done at the moment. It is. It's fascinating. Yes, sir.
How consistent with the various writings of, let's say, Isaiah?
That is what we're going to discuss next. That's we're going to spend the whole time on that next. Short answer is depends on which copy you had. You know how I said they had 20 copies or something? Well, one might be exactly like your Bible today. One might be very different from that. Yet they were sitting in the same library, probably used by the same people. And which raises questions of, weren't they concerned about, that's different. If I read that one, it's different, and that one's different. They were still reading and even some of the stuff they wrote would differ radically too. They weren't always, it seems like, concerned with making sure every single word was exactly the same as this copy over here. And that's something that we're trying to still get our minds around why. And we're working on that. Yes, sir.
Just curious, what's the reason that Esther is not included?
Esther, yeah. Esther had a hard time, getting into the canon of scripture. That book was debated for a long time. Even after the scrolls, it was debated because, well, one of the reasons is that in the Song of Solomon, it never mentions God. It never has the word God in it. And it's like, you're going to put a book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. But what's fascinating though is because obviously there's discomfort with that. This book was copied from Hebrew into Greek. So they call the Septuagint. That was the translation that Jews kind of around, like outside of Palestine, used because they read Greek instead of Hebrew. Well, when it was copied into Greek, the Greek version was a whole lot longer than the original Hebrew version. And it was because somebody went through and rewrote the story. But when they did it, they put God everywhere. Like the word God is like all over the place. And so it's a lot longer, a lot fuller with God everywhere. So some were uncomfortable with it. They changed it. Some were fine with it, but eventually it got debated and put in. Yeah.
That could be a good analogy to the difference between Mark and Matthew and Luke.
Right. You have
If you stay consistent with that.
And that has been, well, I'm trying to think if we get into this or not, but there's a practice called rewritten scripture. I don't think that we'll get into that today, but what it was is there's variations. So from we have a copy, let's say of Isaiah, copy of Isaiah that looks just like our Bibles today. One that, yeah, that's Isaiah, but stuff's rearranged, stuff taken out, but it's still Isaiah. Some stuff that's like, well, I mean, they might, like the Noah. They've taken Noah's story and retold it in a way. They've added all kinds of details, and it's Noah, but it's kind of not. It's not Genesis necessarily. It's a kind of a new book. So it's kind of we're kind of getting further and further with it. And then some texts will take like one character, like Enoch, and make a whole story, different story. It's not Bible, but there's a spectrum of how much they would change and how close they would be. And so they're using that spectrum to interpret the synoptic problem, the Gospels. And is that what Matthew's doing? Is that what Luke's doing when they're copying? And so absolutely. Other questions you have? Okay.
Compliment you on your graphics.
I do too.
Oh, thank you. I was mentioning to Brian, I teach only undergrads, and the courses I teach are all freshman level courses, and they could not care less about any of this. And so without videos and graphics and activities in class, they would fall asleep or play with their phones all day. And that's what I have to do.
Well, it's entertaining and it helps you remember the things.
Oh, good.
It does.
Good. That's good to know.
Thank you.
What do they use for it? It's amazing, we're in 2,000 years.
Right. It was like I was like coal. What was the mixture? Soot, or was it? I can't remember the mixture. There's two different mixtures, the red kind and the black kind. And one of the kinds of inks would like seep into the page, and one of them laid on top, really, which would make it easier if you wanted to erase, just kind of scrape it off. But I can't remember the mixture that they had, honestly. Yeah. But I was going to say something like that. One of the things they've done, though, they've tried to do is they've looked at the ink, the mixture of ink, especially since, we're by the Dead Sea and there's so much salt. They've said, could we, because you have to mix it with water, could we tell which ink came from around the Dead Sea as opposed to some like water from somewhere else, because we can get the chemical mixture. And they've began to do that too, to see, because one of the questions has been, were these scrolls all copied right here at this place? Or some people actually have said that this was the Jerusalem temple library. It's hard to justify, but we most think now that many of these scrolls came from somewhere else. They're being brought to the site. The site wasn't where all of them are copied and like housed. And it's possible that this was a headquarters, like a headquarters for that Essene group. The most dedicated of all ones are kind of like monks, if you will, like they're there. But there are others that aren't so rigid, that are kind of out in Palette area, like Israel outside of that area, that have families and kids. The ones that were in really strict couldn't have kids. There were no women, no kids, really strict. And so maybe the thought is if you join the group, you brought your, my books, I bring my books with me, deposit them in the library, because you had to give away all your possessions. You give away to the group your stuff. That's possible. It's possible that part of the war, that's where you're coming there. We're scared. We're running to our headquarters because they don't know what to do. And they bring their valuables and we hide them there. That's probably a lot of what happened too. So there's a lot of connected details that are interesting and significant there.
Did you bring some good resources?
I did. You're welcome to look through these. These are, I'm going to mention these at the end.
Okay.
And we'll talk about them. But essentially, here's an English translation of all the non-biblical ones.
Okay.
So there's a whole other separate book of just the Bible texts. But those are also online for free, and I will show you a site for those. So English translation, best one probably. This is the one I use in class. It's like what are the scrolls? Kind of like what are they?
Some of the history you're
The
telling us
history we
here
talked about,
today.
the site of Qumran. Just it's basically if you want a really good introduction to this topic, that's the place to go.
I'll just grab a picture.
Okay. And then
Yes.
that book is the fullest history we have of the story of how they were discovered. This guy, he lives in Israel. And there's interesting pictures and some. That's one of the better ones. So like they're in the color. These guys that are working on them originally, but he has fully documented, like talked to the shepherds themselves and said, interview them. What did you do? What happened? The guy that bought the scrolls originally, what was going on? And so there's a second volume that isn't out yet. He's taken forever to finish it, but that takes you a pretty long way into all the details that you'd want to know.
He's going to live long enough to do that in our time.
He's getting older, and I wish he would finish before he
How are you?
passes away.
Let's make sure I got it.
I don't know if you were in the group Thursday. I didn't, or the last Thursday, I couldn't get the audio
Oh, no.
to work, and then I went to Zoom and so I don't know what's going to
Trying to get
Technology's good, but when it works.
Yeah, when it works.
Gone up here and Masada down here.
Right.
It's quite a difference.
Right.
I mean, it really is.
And one of the things they discovered is, even though the different distance, a lot of walking was done. Like some of the people that lived at Qumran walked about 2 miles one way to a little settlement where they farmed and cultivated land, and then came back home and went back. I mean, it was a walk.
I've got my map back
Two or
there.
three questions or comments.
Okay.
Yeah, come on to this.
The Dead Sea Scrolls in the spring of 1967.
Yeah.
And that's got me interested.
Oh, really?
You say they were published late, so.
They were, well, the first 7, right? The ones they discovered first, that were more like intact. Okay. The ones the shepherds discovered, once they were sold, those were pretty much published like that.
Okay.
Just those. Because they were kind of intact, we can just print this. Well, K4, all the big, they're all like this. And so that was 75% of the collection. So most of them were like this, and it took a long time to get them put together. It was in 1991. They were first made public, and it wasn't on purpose. Someone, in fact, I'll tell you what, tell that story. When we get back, just remind me, I'll tell the whole story because that's an interesting story.
Okay, another question. Why do we think that God is masculine and feminine? And the reason I'm coming from, someone, you see plural mentions in the Old Testament.
Right, yeah, the Elohim, yeah.
And with Muhammad, it's we instead of
Right,
God, he or I.
right.
Well, I told you that when it got translated from Semitic languages, Aramaic, Greek, Greek had the word for he from the time.
Well, the they is, well, that's not what I'm saying.
At some point,
There's a Greek word for him, like a singular, and then a plural for them. The
okay,
one of
maybe
the,
it was
one of the issues, there is plurality in, like, let us make man in our image, plural there. Well, part of it is the Canaanite religion, so where Israel develops out of, they had a pantheon of gods. So they had a male god, his name was El, and a female goddess, Asherah, and then like God, Baal and Lot, and but they had a whole crew. And so the idea, many think that when they say let us, some will say that's the Trinity. Let us is the Trinity. Other scholars believe that us, the plural, is the pantheon of gods. Like God would convene a group, like we're going to get together today and talk about making humans, and they discuss it. And so the discussion is part of this pantheon. But the word for God in Hebrew, Elohim, is and that's a debated topic too. Why many think that it's like a plurality of majesty, like God is so majestic and big and important. But it's one of those unanswered questions. So that.
sort of Christians, I know, that.
So yeah, and that's why, yeah.
What it was saying to me was that Greek had the same word, him and they. And that, taking it from Greek, had to pick one of the others, so it went to him, and then that's what it's come down to.
Greek has a word for a word for he, and it's different from she, and it has a separate one for they. Now they obviously can't tell the gender there, but
Okay.
it does have a he and a she, and a they. That's separate.
Okay, well, then I got to do that.
But the question you're asking is a hard one that hasn't really been nailed down. Here's your definite answer. Yeah. Yeah.
That you were put down in the front of.
There's a lot of things that scholars talk about,
People curse each other over that difference.
and they'll debate it, and they'll go to their graves. I'm right. Well, I'll just tell you, I don't know. I don't know.
You look familiar. Your face is bigger than you do too, and I can't play fly.
Now, everybody, there's still some over at your table right there. Not there. There's some here that are not. Oh, okay, she's over there. While the others are coming in, I'll answer one question that was asked. It's probably, maybe I should have mentioned before. One of the questions that was asked about the time frame as far as they were discovered in 47 first, and then until 56, and then weren't published until the 90s. What's going on there? Well, it's interesting. In 1991 is when they were first released to the public. Not on purpose. The release of the scrolls was not on purpose at all. Two things actually happened. One of the things was brilliant. A Jewish scholar got his hand on a concordance. A concordance is like a book that tells you all the places where a word appears in, let's say, the Bible. So let's say beginning, that word. Okay, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, there's that, and it'll list that word, that verse, Genesis 1:1, and then part of the verse. And then the next case you get like the beginning of something else, Exodus 23 something. Here's part of the verse. Well, somebody made one of those. Somebody made a concordance for all the scrolls. They had the information. It was just sitting there. They made one for that. So we have every single Hebrew word that's in all of the scrolls with part of the verse, listed there. Well, they were donated to libraries, to academic libraries. And then this scholar got one of those concordances and using a student too. He worked out every single verse that he could. So if it said Genesis 1:1, he found that part. Genesis 1:2, he found this. He went through and found every single one and put them together like a puzzle because he had that information. And he didn't know if he was right, but turns out he was actually pretty close to what they should have said. And he put it into a book and published it in 1991. It made the original team very upset. Let's just say that. They were not happy about that because they didn't want them to get out yet. And part of the reason is because their careers were on the line. If I'm the first one to publish, this fragment right here, the first one to ever see, I'm gonna publish it, and that's gonna get my tenure at Harvard and so that's important for me to be the first one to get it out there. Well, this guy jumps the gun and tells everybody what's in these scrolls. And that was part of it. The other part was in California, there was a library where they had copies, like pictures, photographs of the scrolls, because a lady there had donated large sums of money to the project. And in return, they gave her pictures and she donated to the library. And they were in a special collection. Nobody knew it until a new librarian comes onto the scene. And he's looking through, what do we have here? We have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And nobody is offer these to the public. And well, he does. He opens up and says, here, anybody wants these, you can look at them. And that was, no, please. They're like, please don't. So he does that in 91. The guy does the concordance in 91. And then someone else had got some secret pictures that he was publishing using a book. So all of this happens in 1991 to the point where the people that had the control of the scrolls finally had to say, fine, you can see them all. And they made them public later on in that year. But that's how they came out. It wasn't on purpose. It was accident, I guess.
Off topic, before you transition out of break, we had a request from the online folks.
Okay.
They could see the scroll, the project your student did, all of that.
Huh.
So
I don't know is this the camera?
the camera there, you might have to stop screen sharing where they can see it.
Oh, huh. Let's see. Okay, let me see if I can they see this? I
Let
can't.
me see if I can make that one, but not like for everyone. Okay.
Have you seen?
Yeah, I think so.
Can't see that.
Okay. That's not the way.
Thank goodness.
Can every here?
Let me replace. There we go. Okay. So what we're seeing is on the side, but on everybody else, I'm seeing exactly the right thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is the project that my student did. It took her a long time. Made a little. This is the case for the jar, the scroll jar that she put it in. So this was the project that she worked on for me, which I appreciate. But this is roughly the right size. This is the size of an ancient book. Of course, it raises all kinds of questions. This is one of the books. I'm writing a book right now at the moment on secretaries or amanuenses, which you use a secretary to write for you when you're writing a letter, let's say, and questions about the logistics, like where do you write, how do you copy? They had tables, but they didn't use tables back then. They didn't use tables to write on. They would what?
I just said,
Oh, they said who?
Sorry.
They would sit on the ground actually and pop their knees up and use their knees to write, to make a flat surface and write on their knees. It was a terribly dumb way to do it, but that's what they did. Even though you have tables, and it was just kind of crazy. let's see. So I need to,
Those might have been too rough.
Were all of the scrolls written in Hebrew or Aramaic or?
they were, most of the ones that we have are in Hebrew. There are some in Aramaic and a few in Greek. Let's see, hide that. Okay. There we go. All right. Let's start back with this. Now, so we looked at the first part. So that was part number one. The second part that I mentioned that we would look at is the text of the Bible, and it's specifically the text of the Hebrew Bible or Jewish scriptures, or what we would call the Old Testament. So here's my question I want to start out with. Here's what I always ask my audience. How confident are you that your English, whatever English Bible you use, whatever translation you have, how confident are you that it is an accurate reproduction of what the ancient authors wrote 2,000, 3,000 years ago? Give me a number. Give me just throw it out there. Like I'm 100% confident. I'm 90%, I'm 1%. 50%, 30, I hear 10, 0.
What's your number?
Oh, I'm 0% confident it's exactly that, but I would guess, I don't know, maybe it's 70% overlap.
70, okay, so okay. Well, it's an interesting question because obviously thousands of years have passed between, what they wrote and then where we're at today. And one of the things I get a lot is, well, there's lots of translation issues. And that's, when you go from Hebrew to Greek to Latin, actually, that's a misnomer. Let me correct that just up front. So if you hear that, that's not entirely correct because, like I mentioned, the scrolls, the Isaiah copy, let's say, we have a copy of Isaiah in Hebrew. We can read it in Hebrew if we want to. We can read it in Greek too, or not, but we can read it in Greek or Hebrew. So we don't necessarily depend on someone else's translation. Our English Bibles are translations, but we actually can read the Hebrew text ourselves. We don't have to go through translation. So that's kind of a misnomer. Some people think that. But what we don't have in this case are originals. I usually ask my students a trick question. I'll say, where would I find, if I want to know if Genesis has been corrupted, if I want to know that there's changes made to Genesis, where would I go, to the the Vatican or Louvre, or where would I go to find the original to check it out? And they're like, oh, we'll go here, or surely at whatever museum they have them, but we don't. We don't have originals or autographs. And in fact, one of the questions that scholars are wrestling with now is, were there ever autographs? Because the books back then went through various processes of composition. They changed over time, and that's one issue. But many will say, well, isn't this the telephone game? If I, in my classes, I'll play the telephone game to illustrate this oftentimes. I have stopped recently. I was in a class one time, and it was really small. There were 30 people in the class. This is a freshman class. So you can imagine. We started a message, and the message was the farmer jumped over the fence to save his horse, something like that. And I started my message over here in the classroom, and it went around the desks, and it circled to the very back. By the time I got to the very back, I had the gentleman in the back. I said, "Would you stand up and tell us what you heard?" And his face got a little red, and he said, "Are you sure?" I said, yeah, you're embarrassed, or what? He stood up and he repeated the message, and it was filthy. It was not what I started. And so then my face gets red, and I didn't do that. I didn't say that. But I finally figured I could trace it back. I could tell there was a guy in the back who purposefully changed it to be funny. And he passed that message along. So some will think, well, is the Bible a case of the telephone game? Well, the scrolls are interesting because they can help us kind of answer this question, at least to some extent. Because what we have are copies of the text from various points throughout history. And in this case, this gives us the earliest copy that we can test. And so what scholars have done with this is called textual criticism. Now, is anybody familiar with textual criticism before? You heard that word before? Textual criticism is the method that scholars use. And when you hear the word criticism, it's not so much criticizing the Bible. That's not the point. It's evaluating the text. So it's saying, can we, for example, if I have, just imagine all these copies were of Genesis. I have a copy of Genesis here, portion of it here, portion of it here. I have like 4 different copies from different points throughout history. Can I take those copies that were all written in Hebrew and can I piece them back together? So if I have 4 different copies of verse 1 in the beginning, could I then find any differences? And then could I then determine which of those copies was the more accurate or the more original or the earlier copy? That's the process of textual criticism. And so here is the way it works. So imagine Isaiah. Let's say that, Isaiah, today's scholars think that it was written over an extended amount of time by different authors, but let's say the book of Isaiah was written in 700 BC. So the original copy then would be made in Hebrew. Copies of that original, let's say, would be made, copy there, copies of the copies are made, and then copies of the copies, then translated into Greek. So we have Hebrew originally, eventually it gets translated in Greek, later into Aramaic. So we have copies in various languages. Now, when these copies are made, usually mistakes are made. That's a natural part of copying. When things are copied by hand, usually you make mistakes. And all of the copies that we have of pretty much every biblical manuscript has usually some kind of mistake, some kind of error or copying mistake in it. And so all of these are problematic in that sense. We have to figure out which one is correct. Well, we have no originals, right? The originals are gone. Those are lost time. We have to figure out then, based on all the copies, what do we do now? What did it say originally? And so here's how it works.
Until the invention of the printing press, the only way for scripture to be shared with others, aside from public reading, was through the long, tedious process of copying it word for word by hand. The people who did this were called scribes. Now, as you can imagine, sometimes a scribe would miss a word here or there. In other cases, scribes would add context to what they were copying with a comment in the margin. A later scribe might wonder if this was a correction and put the comment from the margin into the text of scripture. If we want to find the closest text to the original writings, we have to study all of the ancient biblical writings we have access to and compare them to one another. It's important to realize that we currently don't have any complete books of the Bible on a single scroll or codex from before AD 350. But we found enough pieces from as early as 250 BC to be able to piece them together like a giant puzzle. In many cases, we have so many similar, overlapping pieces that we can reasonably conclude that we have the entire book. The method used to determine the original text from these manuscripts is known as textual criticism. There are countless biblical scholars who have spent their lives coming to the best human understanding of what the most accurate original biblical texts are.
So again, if you like puzzles, this is a great thing, puzzle-like kind of question. So how do the scrolls then help us? The scrolls really have changed the game. They have changed the game because, again, it allows us to test how the text was transmitted. How was it copied over about 1,000-year period? It gives us something that we didn't have before that allows us to do that. So what I'm going to do now is this. To give you kind of a State of the Union address of what was it like before. So this is before the scrolls. What do we have? And then after the scrolls, to kind of show you what I mean by how significant these things are. So here's your warning. So this is before the scrolls, what we had are the earliest copies of our Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, date to around 1000 AD. These are called the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex. These are about roughly the same time. This is what most are using. Now, here we go. We don't have these. We don't have this. We didn't have any of this. Maybe some of this, but a lot of this was gone too. What we're dealing with is this. And we call this the Masoretic text. So the Masoretic text is a text that were made by Masoretes, but it was codified and put together right here, 1080. This is the rough estimate. So this is the text that most English Bibles are translated from. It's this. Now, the question obviously is, well, is that any good? What do we think? Well, even before the scrolls, we recognize that that's not the greatest of text. It's not a perfect text because there were, in some cases, errors, in some cases, lacuna, or missing pieces. So I'll show you both. Here's an example of an error that even without the scrolls, we can say this is wrong. So we've got the NIV over here. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, with the wife of his neighbor, it says both the adulterer and the adulteress are put to death. This is in Leviticus 20, verse 10. So the New Revised Standard over here, notice how they're doing different things. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress should be put to death. What's different about these two texts, if you can see that?
They took out just another man's wife and made it just the neighbor.
Okay, so what you got is can you see the pink part? You can. In Hebrew, the NIV is copying literally the Hebrew text of the Masoretic. They're copying, or they're translating identically, just like it is. The problem is in Hebrew, that part that's in pink, even though they've translated it a little bit differently. So with another man's wife versus with the wife of his neighbor, it's identical in Hebrew. It's the exact same phrase done twice. So have you ever been writing something, like you write it down and you copy it, you look up, you copy it again, but you don't realize you copied the exact same thing twice in a row because your eyes caught the wrong thing and you weren't really paying attention anyway. And so you have double. That's what they've done here in the Hebrew text. The NIV just finds a creative way to do it, to make it look like it's not the same, but it's just an error. The NRSV just decides, oh, we realize this is a problem with our text. The text is wrong here. I'm going to erase that part. And so they leave it out. So we knew this was there all along, and before the scrolls. Two, so there are mistakes in the text that we have, but also missing parts. So if you read the NIV at 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1, it says this: Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. Now, if you read the NRSV, it's something different. Saul was ... years old when he began to reign, and he reigned ... and 2 years over Israel. Now, if you don't believe me, and this my students usually don't, if you have an NRSV, you can check this out. It literally says ... Like, and you come to this, like, how do you, if Brian's going to preach on how do you preach ... I mean, this is, I don't know. This is strange. But what it is that here's why this is different. Because in the Masoretic text, this is what it has. It's missing this part in that text. And so the NRSV says, all right, we don't know what it should have said. We're just going to leave it and let you fill in the blank if you want to. The NIV is uncomfortable with that. They say, no, we can't preach on this. We need some numbers. And so they go back to the Greek translation, the Septuagint, and find a number, which is 30. And then they add that in there. The King James is a different number because they're doing different things. But notice, these are problems that we knew before. We knew it was there. We knew it was a problem. But that's just the text that we had. That's all we had before the scrolls. Now, what's interesting and important is pretty much every single English translation today, even today, still are depending upon one single copy, one single manuscript from this Masoretic tradition. They're copying from that one, even after the scrolls have been discovered. Now, after the scrolls, how have the scrolls helped us understand the text better? Well, three things. One of the things they've done is they have given us the earliest copies of the Jewish Bible, or the Old Testament, that have ever been discovered. Now, again, there's no New Testament here. There's no Gospels. There's no Paul. It's just Old Testament, the earliest copies ever. So what they did is this. So this is what we're working with, right? Masoretic text, it's got problems. Jesus, let's say Isaiah. Well, it can get us even before, even earlier. So some of the text, when Jesus was around, some of the texts were even like 200 years old then. So even before Jesus, they're pretty old. So it can get us way back before that. It's much earlier and really important. But of course, it raises the question. But are they the same? Right? Is it identical to Isaiah and Genesis, or have things changed? And what you get a lot, and I'm going to show you an example of this. I hear this a lot, either on like little YouTube clips, or if I hear people, oftentimes when I hear it from pulpits, people talk about this. This sounds good, but it's not entirely correct. So listen to this is what I hear quite a bit.
This is a very, very important question, because how do we know that the translations that we read today in Holy Scripture or the Bible resemble the original manuscripts? Over the centuries, some have claimed that scribal errors were intruding, and then there were copies of the errors, and those got exaggerated so that today we don't have much resembling what the original manuscripts were like. Well, this argument is faulty. In fact, it's totally wrong. This was demonstrated in 1947 when the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And in the caves at Qumran and along the Dead Sea where they were discovered, they found a scroll of Isaiah that was 250 years old, even in Jesus' day. This was a thrilling discovery because now it gave biblical scholars a chance to compare the writing, the text of Isaiah from 250 BC with the earliest manuscript version we have of Isaiah, which is the so-called Masoretic text from the 11th century AD. Now there was a 1,350-year span against which to check the accuracy of the biblical manuscripts as they were recopied.
Notice
the result, 99.8% exactly the same language.
Okay, so that sounds pretty good, right? If the copies that we have among the Dead Sea Scrolls are 99.8% the same as the ones that in your Bible, nothing's changed. We're good there. But it's not entirely accurate. It's just simply not true. There's some truth to it, and we're going to come to that, but most of it is not really informed. And I'll give you this as I share this as good news, bad news. Usually people look at this way, but it's not. I think it's interesting. So the good news, quote unquote good news, is this. It is true. What he's suggesting here, it is true in some sense that over about 1,000-year period, the text of the Old Testament did go almost unchanged for 1,000 years, in the sense that hardly a word differed from one point to the next point. That is true. So in some sense, what he's saying is, if I test this manuscript here and say, oh, that looks a whole lot like this, in fact, 99.8%, and that again is, that gets cheery in church. I came out of a tradition that was much more conservative than I am now. They would amen everything, So you get an amen from that one. Yeah, amen. There you go. Preach it. That would make you happy because our Bibles nothing's changed. Well, I'm curious if you all could spot the issue just from what you've heard so far. I'm going to see what kind of crowd I got here. So what he's saying, first of all, make sure you got this. What book of the Bible? Which one did he mention? Isaiah. Now, the text that the scroll he's talking about is that great Isaiah scroll. It's the one I mentioned the first one discovered, the whole thing of Isaiah. It's the one that's wrapped around the shrine of the book, that big glass case. That's the one. And he says that if I compare the great Isaiah scroll with my Bible today, identical. They're 99.8%. Do you see any issue to that? Or maybe what questions that you have with that?
That 0.2% could be like a really big deal.
Oh, okay. So what's that could make a difference.
Let's eat comic kids.
Okay. Good point. What else do you see that's possibly maybe a question you want to have from this method of assessing?
Is that true for the other books?
Okay. Well, not even and not just other books, but also what do we know about the numbers here?
Other versions of Isaiah? Yeah, you said there were 3 versions.
How many copies of each book did I say were discovered at Qumran? Usually more than just one. I mean, one thing if we had one copy of Isaiah and it says the same thing, great. But actually, we have what he's doing then is this. What he says is let's lay out the Isaiah stuff, and he points to one. Mm-hmm. You see that? You see that one up there? Yeah, that's the same as my Bible there. Well, the problem is there's 20 other copies of Isaiah that's part of the collection, and you want to compare those too, buddy. That's the issue. And so when you do that, then other questions go, oh, what about that one or that one or that one? Now, Well, those don't work. We're not gonna talk about those, right? We're just gonna, this one matches, so it matches. That's the issue. But even then, even that's a problem. But, and this is where a lot of people will repeat information they don't really understand. What he's repeating is not true, because if you compare the great Isaiah scroll, so if you look at the evidence for that scroll, there's over 2,600 variants, places where that scroll differs in words or readings from our text that used in our Bible today. That's not a small, in 2,600 places is not a small number. That's and there are, besides those, there are 7 large additions. Now most of these, I will admit, most of these are spelling differences. So Hebrew can be spelled with like helper vowels. And so that's a spelling issue. It's not a big deal at all. But there are 7 like large, either like entire verses or sentences or phrases where the Isaiah scroll doesn't have certain things. The Masoretic text, many believe, is actually a later text that added to, or that expanded over the years. So quite a bit of difference with possibly some major differences. So even that one he's pointing to doesn't fit what he's saying. There's some issues there, but there's a bigger issue, and this is the quote unquote bad news. It's not bad news. I think it's the most interesting of all news. That's what I think it is. But some take it as bad because of just perceptions they have. Even though the text stayed stable for a long time, before it kind of solidified, before it became fixed, what the scrolls show us is that it actually circulated in multiple forms, in different forms. And this is the second point. So point 2 is, around Jesus' time, the text of the Old Testament was what I would call pluriform, or existing in various different forms. Now, I mentioned that, I showed this before. So if Jesus wanted to read the book of Exodus, we have discovered 3 different editions he could have done. He could have read at the time. But I realized it's hard to get your mind around what is it, because sometimes my students will say, well, that's kind of like the King James versus the NIV, right? No, it's not the these and the thous versus the yous. No, it's not the translation issue. This is different. And so what I want to show, I'm going to illustrate this to you. So if you would, I don't know if I have people here, but if you need to share, you might need to share the person beside you, possibly. I think I have 40 of these, but these are for you. You're going to take these home. You can have these. You want, how many of you are familiar with the David and Goliath story? Okay, most everybody. Yeah. I found this like last year. I had a student who had never ever heard of this, never even heard the names David and Goliath. It was the first time ever I'd had a student not realize that. So I won't go through the story with you then. I'm assuming that you know the story. But what I want to do is I'm going to use the papers I'm giving you to illustrate what an addition is. When I say multiple additions, this is what I mean. So, is anybody, we've got more over here. Does anybody else need? So we've got extras. And if you want, over here. And if you all, let's see, anybody doesn't want to share, or you got some extras, there's some you don't want to share. Got plenty more. Okay. If anybody wants their own, you can have these. But you can have these, take these home with you. So what I want you to do is kind of just read, not like in depth. Just look through that for a second. Just like flip through the pages. And what you have is this. So on the, make sure I'm telling you right. On the right side, this is the story that's in most of our Bibles today. So most every English translation today has the right side on there. That's the way the story will be told in your Bible. On the left side is the text, the full text in Greek. So it's a Greek translation. It's part of the Old Greek, the Septuagint. Now, we had the one on the left. We had it in existence before the Dead Sea Scrolls. So scholars knew it was there. But they thought, this is not a very good text. This is, one, it's a translation, so who knows if they got it right. And two, what do you notice about the one on the left? What just immediately, what stands out to you? It's missing pieces. They're missing a bunch of pieces, missing 43%, like half of the thing is missing. And so they said, somebody got this wrong. And so we can't try, like, this is a bad, this Greek, no, this is awful. And they didn't pay it much attention because they assumed that somebody just messed up. Well, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And what they found was that this same story in the same kind of version of the one on the left, was discovered in Hebrew at Qumran. Now, not the whole thing, because this is a long text. And again, part of these are like fragments. But what they discovered was apparently there was a Hebrew text. This Greek, it wasn't just that it's like leaving out a bunch of stuff. Whatever it was copying from in Hebrew apparently existed just like this. So there was a Hebrew version just like so. So what you need to realize is originally there was one version or one edition, like the one on the left, and then one version like the one on the right. Both of these two copies probably sat in the library at Qumran beside each other. You can pick which one you want. They both existed at that time. Now, couple of differences. What do you look, if you will, chapter 17, verse 4. I think it's the first page. How tall was Goliath?
That's a big difference.
4 cubits versus 6 cubits.
Thinking of Bill Cosby.
So cubit would be like here to here, which you're going to ask, well, isn't it different from everybody? Yes. But roughly, here's the rough estimate. 4 cubits, the one on the left, I think, would be 6 feet 6. The one on the right would be 9 feet 6. That helps us in putting it in feet. So 6 feet 6, 9 feet 6. Now, the one on the right is obviously a giant. 9 feet 6 is, like this high, right? This is giant anywhere. What was the average height in that day, by the way?
Probably short.
Give me an estimate. 5'4", 5'6", 5'3". The average was about 5 feet tall. So if the average, if David's a boy too, he's gonna be. So if you were 6 feet 6, you were a giant. If that's everybody's 5 feet tall. So either way, he's still a giant. But it is a difference in numbers here. How about here we go. Here's the old Greek. There it is. Here's the difference. He's 4 cubits versus 6 cubits. How about what weapons did Goliath have? Chapter 17, verse 45. What's Goliath carrying? And again, you'll notice like some of the difference, if it's different, it's in bold print. That kind of clues you in as a difference there.
And a spear and javelins in the right side.
Okay, so on the one hand, the one on the old Greek says he has a sword with a spear and shield. And then the one on the right says a sword and a spear and a javelin. So which was it? There's some small differences like this. And you say, well, that's not a big deal, right? Not huge. But again, a lot of this adds up. So you have, he's 9 feet 6 versus 6 feet 6. How he dies is a little bit different. So in one of the stories, you have David takes the slingshot, hits him in the head, knocks him down. The rock alone kills him. That's it. And he comes and takes the sword then and cuts his head off for good measure. He's already dead. The other story is hits the forehead, knocks him down. He's still alive. Then he takes the sword out, chops his head off to kill him. A little different thing. But you have different ways of dying. And then, of course, the big thing is one's 43% longer than the other one. Now, this is what I mean. Now, I wanted to show you this to illustrate to you because it's hard to tell you. This is what I mean by multiple editions. So if I say the book of Exodus existed in multiple editions at Qumran, it's this. So some of the books would have been, one edition might have been shorter. One might have been longer. One might have had chapters. In Jeremiah, actually, the chapters are rearranged. They're not in the same order that we have today. There might have been a verse missing. There might have been a bunch of verses missing. There might have been details that were different. This is what I mean. It's not. Don't think versions King James versus NIV. Don't think versions like that. Think like this. This is what I mean. And so again, what scholars discovered is there were multiple ones like this. Like almost every single book we've discovered, at least enough where there's enough text to like, okay, we can make a judgment here because there's enough there. Where there's enough information to judge, most books, it seemed like, circulated in these multiple editions. There were various forms the books had. Now, if you're interested in this, here's a resource. Now, I'm going to give you more resources at the end, but here's one you might want to know. It's dssenglishbible.com. And what it is this. You can see on the left side over here, it is all of the biblical scrolls and how many there are. So you got 22 of Genesis, 17 of Exodus. It lists the scrolls on the side, and you can pick. Okay, I want to compare the Exodus scrolls, especially with your modern Bible. Well, what it does is, let's say if you pick Exodus 2, Exodus 1. This manuscript is 2Q2 Exodus A. It gives you the language, it gives you the date that it was written, the location, and what it contains. And notice it doesn't contain the whole book of Exodus. It's just a portion of it. But what it does is, in black, that's where that text and your Bibles are the same. But if it has like blue or green or red or it has crossed through, or that's where it tells you something is different here than what your Bible reads. This is a helpful resource if you want to ever compare how are these scrolls different from or similar to my Bible today, and it's free. So that's something to go to. Number 3, and this is the last thing, then we'll wrap up with this and take a break. Number 3 is what the scrolls do for us. It helps us to understand this standardization. When was the Old Testament? When did they say, all right, this is our version. This is the one that we're going to copy from and we're going to use, and not the others? When did it become standard and only this one gets copied? The exact words get copied from now on. Well, the scrolls help us understand that. Here's how. So again, here's your map. This is Qumran. When most of the manuscripts that were discovered here were BC. They were 2nd century BC. They were before Jesus. They were earlier than Jesus. That's most of them, at least. But there were other locations besides Qumran that were discovered. So once archaeologists realized, hey, there's a bunch of caves here that have manuscripts in them. I wonder what other places. And they went down to Merbat and Al-Heber and Masada, and they looked at different places and said, can we find other scrolls there? And they did. Now, not as many. There wasn't as many. There were actually another copy of Isaiah was discovered here at Merbat. So there were more, but not this level. But they found biblical text here, and most of them dated to the 1st century AD. So there's a few hundred years between them. So what that allows us to do then is this. Let's compare. What is the text like here, and how does it compare here? Did it change? What do we find? And one of the things that scholars discovered was this. So before Jesus, and I've got 70 almost as a random, that's when the scrolls were, the Qumran was destroyed. And then I've got question marks, you can see. And that's just because we don't know. Now, if you ask different scholars, they're going to give you an idea and then give you a theory. They don't know. We don't know yet. We're still working on that. But before this, there's all this diversity. This is, multiple David and Goliath stories, multiple Exoduses. That's what you had to choose from. But something happens after about 135, because that's a lot of the ones from other places. That's when they're dating to. But they're all one edition. They're all one standard thing. They don't have that diversity anymore. It seems like somebody or something happened that led them to say, all right, this is the one. This is the one that we're going to use. And there's not, and it might be, this is a maybe, it could be what happens in 70. Because again, what happened in 70? Destruction of the temple. Well, with that, after that, the Essenes, we don't hear them anymore. They're gone. The Sadducees, remember the Sadducees from the Gospels? They're in the Gospels. They're important. They're important in the temple, especially in the priesthood. They disappear too because the temple's gone, so their power is gone. The one group, and of course the Zealots who had the fight, they're kind of gone too. The one group who comes through this are the Pharisees, or they become the rabbis. And so is it possible that like this was the one they preferred? Maybe. That's just a guess. We don't know. But that's one guess. But that becomes the one that everyone's going to use it. So after that, for 1,000 years, this text is the one that's copied. There's not variety, there's not diversity. And when it's copied, buddy, they get it almost identical. They're just word for word, they're copying this thing exactly the same. So before this, diversity, one version is picked. We're going to choose version 2. That's the one we're going to use. That then becomes the Masoretic text. If you want to know where'd that come from, the Masoretic text is made from that one that was selected. And then that Masoretic text is what your English Bible is translated from. Now, that's the process. That's the process by which you got your Old Testament. Now, students will ask me, so do we have what they wrote back then? And my answer is yes. It's kind of complicated, but it's more complex. It takes them a while to explain. Now, here's the question that I'll ask them. Well, how should we communicate that pluriformity in our Bibles today? And this, by the way, is a question. I've got a big academic meeting in November, in a couple of weeks, where scholars, this will be 10,000 scholars from around the world, they'll come and discuss, read papers and debate things. This is one of the questions that we're debating right now in scholarship. It is, given what we know now, we know this now, and again, this is really new, this is really recent. How should we put this into a Bible, into an English Bible for people in churches to use? When you come to the David and Goliath story, should we have 2 different columns? Or can you put these together somehow? Like for Exodus, would you have 3 columns? Or would that freak people out so much that they're like, no, this is crazy. And the question has become, how do we communicate that to people in churches that might be freaked out? Maybe they're not. But how would you want it? What should we do? I'm just curious because people are asking that question right now. How should we print this up to tell you? Do you want us to choose one version and just go with that one? Or do you want multiple possibilities? What's the best way to do it?
I like footnotes.
Footnotes, okay. All right. That's a good way to do it. How about that'd be big. But footnotes are good. Maybe. What else?
And what church people are you talking about? If you're talking about church people who go to class or something else.
Right.
Sermons, then give us some options.
That's a good point. Depending on, especially denomination wise too, that might be some denominations would maybe not like one and some would like another one, and that might freak some out and not others.
I would say it would only matter if it somehow changed the meaning of the story.
All right, and that's something that's important. Goliath gets killed, right? He's 9 feet 6. He's dead. Either way, and that's one thing that you'll notice is the main points usually stay the same, even though they tell it different ways. That's significant.
Just additional books.
Okay.
Exodus A.
I like it. Interesting. Exodus A. That's interesting.
People are going to read. People are going to hunt through and find the phrases that they want.
Right. And it's interesting because I showed you that, right? We have the capability now is to do this electronically, to show you differences. And so it makes it easier to do that. But that's a good idea. I don't know that they're thinking about that, thinking of individual separate books. Interesting. Somebody else had a hand over, I thought. Yeah. Yes.
I prefer the comparison side by side. I have a Bible at home that has King James.
Oh, yes.
And I find that interesting to read and compare right there.
Right.
I don't want to have to go and pick one book off the shelf.
Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point. And it is interesting to note, I'm thinking about the book thing, especially I think about how we access the Bible is so much different today than what they did. I can scroll multiple versions on my computer probably. This is tough. It's tough to do. It's tough to read this, just to read it alone. But then I've got to go get another scroll somewhere else out in the library and bring that one in. how do you, this is one of the questions, the synoptic, probably, you mentioned the synoptic gospels. One question, like, if you're going to copy from another book, where do you put this thing? Where do you put your source? If they're doing this, I know, so you can't see. If they're copying like this is how they copied. You copy. Where do you put your like source text? Like, like there are so many things that we don't think through a lot because we don't have to. We do it differently. And so it's not, it don't cross our mind. That's the case. All right. We'll take a break at this point, 10 minutes or so, use the bathroom, get some more coffee or refreshments, whatever you need. If you have other questions, I'm glad to answer those. And then we'll come back and talk about Jesus. Yes, sir.
I've heard several rabbis speak and thinking about this, the different versions and what have you, translations. The ones that I have heard say this is a story, and you're missing the meaning if you try to take it too literal. So if in the translations, whichever ones you use, if you're using 3 different versions, but they all have the same story,
right.
The meaning behind it, the metaphor.
Right.
That would be the important thing, correct?
Right. And I think that's the point, is that is there. I mean, whichever one you're reading, it's still there. It gets to habit or a preference or something the way many moderns read it, because we want to know. I want to know what's that. Is there a difference there? If I'm copying it, I want to make sure it's exactly the same. One of the things that this shows us is that they weren't as interested in every single word, making sure it's on this page and this page. I'm still going to get the same, meaning and content. Now, they could if they wanted to. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they would change things on purpose to make sure that specific word is there. But they weren't so obsessed with making sure when I copy it, this better be identical to the last copy. They could, but didn't always. They didn't have that obsession that sometimes we have. Yeah, maybe. And I was mentioning to somebody else at the last break, we actually have, I don't think I put that, I think I left that slide off. We have a spectrum. So sometimes so I go from here to here. So there are some texts that they would copy that were identical to what they had before. So this is like, the Isaiah, it's identical to Isaiah. Let's say Genesis, identical to Genesis. There are some copies that we have that are, you can see variation, just like the David and Goliath. It's shorter, words are changed in some cases. But you still say that's still David and Goliath's story. That's 1 Samuel. You know what it is. But there's some stuff even further over that you're like, well, that's Noah. There's Noah, and it's had a flood, but there's a bunch that's different. That this is not Genesis anymore, or is it? You can't really tell because it almost sounds like a separate book. And there's some over here that are like, well, that's Noah, all right, or that's Enoch, but this is definitely not Genesis. But they use that character as a jumping off point, kind of like a spin-off series in TV. They use that character to start a new book. So there's like this whole spectrum of very different to pretty different to kind of different to the same, but they're all part of that library that people are using, and you can choose what you want.
My first thought when I heard you talking about all the different copies was somebody's mom came through and said, John, you wanted it. Now clear that out.
It's interesting, yeah.
But then the second thought was that, to paraphrase that history quote, history is preserved by the survivors.
Right. Okay. And what it also raises a question, what you said the first time makes me think. I showed you the picture of the back way up now. Of the scriptorium. This is a room. You can see here the arrow. There's a room that had little desks, basically like a little thing, little desks. And this is, they found, thank you very much, inkwells they found there, and some writing material. And some said to me, oh, that's, with all these scrolls, that must be where they write things. Maybe, but we don't know. But we know that in their text, they talk about a time when we all get together. If they're all together and they're reading scripture. And many think they did it together. And so maybe if they have 900, scrolls, maybe everybody has their own copy of the Bible, which would have been unheard of back then. Usually books were expensive and you didn't even have a book. They were expensive. So if every one of them are using, let's say, one of those 21 copies of Isaiah, and they're all different, and they're reading out loud, like that presents an interesting dynamic in their little services they would do. But it raises all kinds of questions.
So, trying to think of how to phrase this. Take Genesis, for example. You got, multiple creation stories, multiple flood stories.
Right.
They're all part of our English text,
right?
Presumably also in the Masoretic text. We're looking at the fragments of that from somewhere like Qumran. Are we seeing, say, in a single fragment, multiple stories of creation or flood, or are those coming from, say, different fragments that are then being kind of pulled together at a later date? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. No. That's really. So let's take Isaiah. That's easy.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, I've got this up here. And I don't know how familiar you are with like Genesis, like you mentioned, the multiple creation stories. So Genesis 1 through 2, verse 4 is one story. There's another story after that. But one of the things that scholars believe is that there were multiple, that the Old Testament, many books are made up of multiple sources. And these sources are kind of put together like a quilt. And so what the scrolls give us would be, if this is, let's say, the original Genesis over here, or Isaiah, because it's multiple too. Those, by the time it gets to us, our copies in Qumran, those are already there.
Okay.
And so the Isaiah copy we have contains first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah, all together already. And so the Genesis 1 and 2 would already be. So
by the time of Qumran.
What he's talking about, if you're not familiar with that. So I'm saying over here, the copies we have variations all over the place. But we also know this, before they get to us in, let's say, 1, over here, there was also lots of variations in the sense that the stories probably circulated in multiple forms independently. And I'll give you like an example, the Joseph story. Joseph story in Genesis, when Joseph gets sold into slavery. You want to go home and write this down? I'm trying to think of the verse chapter number. I can't remember offhand. 40 something. When Joseph gets sold into slavery by his brothers, go home and read that in your English Bible. It doesn't make sense when you read it, because he gets sold different times by different groups. And he gets taken down to Egypt by one group, by Midianites, and then he gets down to Egypt and he's sold by another group, by Ishmaelites. And it's like, this doesn't like line up. Like, there's a problem here. You would notice it in your English Bibles. Well, what you can do though is this. You can actually, I do this in my class, in my one class period, we spend time doing this, and I give them every single verse. I cut them up little pieces, and they get little verse, verse 1, 2, 3, 4, and they have to rearrange. And so what you can do is you can actually take these stories apart, and you can read the 2 Joseph stories as 2 separate independent accounts that make complete sense. In one case, there's Midianites that trade him and sell him down into Egypt. One case, the Ishmaelites trade him and sell him down to Egypt. And the verses read perfectly like this as separate stories. But, and probably we believe that, the story we have today was this. And then this is what it was originally. So somebody took these 2 independent accounts of Joseph being sold into slavery and put them together. And that's the story we have now. We have this combination, this quilt, if you will, a quilt version of their stories. They didn't want to leave out a drop. They were like, It's completely, even to the point where it doesn't make sense when you read it because they brought them together like this. And it causes problems. But if you separate them, they're there. Yes, sir.
How now you combine multiple versions of the same story?
Yeah, right. Well, it's interesting because sometimes he mentioned the creation stories. The creation stories are side by side, like this. There's one story, two stories. But then the Noah's flood story, the flood story, two stories that like this. So how long did it rain? One that says 40 days, one says 150 days. They're overlapping. But it's interesting to see that quilt being put together. But the quilt was put together way over here, like long before it got down to our copies at Qumran. And so there's variation all over the place, even before it gets to us, which again, I think is interesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Travis.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
Just wondering about, kind of the totality of what you're saying and how does that jive with, I'm reading from the statements of beliefs of the Cypress Baptist Church in Louisiana, where our new Speaker of the House is. Just trying to be topical. And they say, we believe the Holy Bible is the inspired Word of God without any error and all sufficient authority in matters of faith, doctrine, and Christian living. So
that's a good question.
Well, I don't even. I hope that works.
Let me answer. I can't answer it well because let me start this. There was a book. I was listening to it today. A podcast about it too. I may have to send you the name. It was like something about when the Bible became inspired, something like that. But it's by Princeton University Press. Just came out this last year. But what she does is she's a really good scholar. She goes through and talks about the rabbis when they began to think of the Bible as inspired, as like a single unified. God did this, and it should say the same thing because God's behind it. Versus earlier, like when we're dealing with, they weren't thinking in those terms. Like, if God is doing the whole thing, it must be all the same and no mistakes or, that kind of thing. They weren't thinking in those kind of categories before the rabbis, before like 70 AD, that area. But she documents in the book, I've not read the whole thing, but she supposedly documents when this kind of change of thinking that the Bible as this book that should say the same thing. It's inspired by God to say the same, because of that. But it's supposedly happening in the later rabbinic period. But then it makes it down to us, and we think that's the natural way to think about it. The Bible is just, this one collective book that's all inspired and God did it, and it's not as messy. I would say it's messy. It's messier earlier on. I would say that. I know that doesn't answer the question, but I'm trying to get out of his it's like,
Well, how about for Christianity?
For Christianity.
Yeah, or Jesus.
The situation in the New Testament is different than this stuff. The New Testament we have better evidence in terms of it's much closer to so even let me go back to this, sorry. Even this, so we're still not close. We're still 700 years away from that, right? Even with the scrolls. So that's good. It's better than we had, but we have copies of the New Testament that are like 100 years apart, not that far off. They're much closer to the originals, and we have tons of them, tons of copies in Greek, other languages, church father references. So we have a lot more evidence to work with and a lot earlier evidence to work with. Not to say that it's perfect, but it's fuller. It's fuller in the New Testament than it is the Old. Okay. All right, let's move on to this last thing and make sure you have enough time to finish this up. And so we looked at the story, discovery, what's in the scrolls, how does it relate to the Bible? And then finally, how does it relate to Jesus? What do the scrolls tell us about Jesus? Now, when the scrolls were first discovered, there were lots of things that went around that saying, remember the teacher of righteousness that I mentioned, the leader of the group? They said, that's Jesus. There he is. Because there's some similarities there between him and Jesus. Some said, no, that's actually John the Baptist. Jesus is the bad guy in these stories. Some said, no, this is Paul. There were lots of these. I mean, and somebody actually even, somebody made the case that one of the fragments, it was about this big, by the way, one of the fragments in Greek from the scrolls contained a copy of the Gospels. Now, the justification for that was on this copy, it had the word Kai. Does anybody know what Kai is in Greek?
And.
What? And. It's the most common word in Greek. And that's the only word you can make out. So you're telling me the Gospel of Mark is no. But that's the kind of thing. And so these aren't Christian texts. They're not. These are Jewish texts from around Jesus' time by a group who don't appear in the Bible, actually. They're never mentioned in the Bible. But they have, if you understand them, Jesus can be viewed in a different light, maybe possibly, than what you might view him in. And it gives us some perspective. So how do the scrolls help us better understand Jesus' message and his ministry? And I think that it does. I think that it kind of sheds interesting light on that. And so here's my answer. What the scrolls do, especially, is provide us with insights into the efforts of this group, the Essenes, this very conservative group, and how ancient Jews tried to maintain purity. Now, I know that's could be a loaded term. What does purity mean? Purity before God, and then by application into ways that Jesus challenged existing regulations, rules, viewpoints about God, about people's responsibility to others, all of that. Jesus has a pretty radical view when you view it in light of the scrolls. So that's where we're going. So first up, let's back up for a second and look at purity. When I say purity, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Anything?
Cleanliness.
What?
1990s.
Cleanliness.
Cleanliness. Now here, what?
The 1990s.
1990s. Why the 90s?
Purity culture.
Purity. I remember I was in a very fundamentalist church growing up, where we heard a lot about preaching about sin and you better not sleep with your girlfriend, and we had like purity rings they would give us, like you were supposed to vow not to ever sleep with anybody when you're in high school, and they told us if you do you're going to go to hell, and I was scared to death. But that's what I think of. The first thing that comes to my mind is that, because it's ingrained in me. Purity is important, but a lot of times we don't talk a lot about it, especially Jewish purity. And so let's spend some time here on purity regulations. So what it is the grounding of purity, Jewish purity, is the fact that God is holy. God is holy and can't be around anything that's impure. That's opposite of him. And here's the way that here's the way of thinking about purity that helps us get into this idea.
You've probably heard the word holy before, or at least sang it in a church song once or twice. And for most people, this idea is really just connected to being a morally good person. So God is holy because he's morally perfect.
Yeah, that is part of it. But in the Bible, the idea of holiness is even bigger and more rich. What it's really describing is how God is the creative force behind the whole universe. He's the one and only being with the power to make a world full of such beauty and life. And so all these abilities, they make God utterly unique, which is the meaning of the word holy. So a helpful way to think about God's holiness is by using the sun as a metaphor. The sun is unique, at least within our solar system, and it's really powerful. It's the source of all this beautiful life on our planet. And so you could say that the sun is holy. And you can actually take this metaphor even further in that the whole area around the sun is also holy.
Yeah, because the closer you get to the sun, the more intense it gets.
Yeah, exactly. So that very power and goodness that generates all this life is also dangerous. I mean, the sun, if you get too close, will annihilate you. And in the same way, there's this paradox at the heart of God's own holiness, because if you're impure, His presence is dangerous to you. And not because it's bad, but because it's so good. And so the first time we see this paradox of God's holiness, it's in the story of Moses and the burning bush.
So God tells Moses to take off his sandals because he's standing on holy ground. And Moses covers his face in fear, and God says, hey, don't come any closer. It's intense.
It's actually that intensity of God's holiness that's explored even more in the stories about Israel's temple, which was the main place where God's holy presence was located. And at the center of the temple was this room called the Most Holy Place, the hot spot of God's presence. And whether you're an Israelite living in the land around the temple or a priest working right in the temple, you're in proximity to God's holy presence, which is dangerous.
Yeah, this is a problem.
All right, and this is the problem, especially if you're unholy. So in the Mosaic covenant, so when they escape Egypt, the Israelites escape Egypt in the Old Testament, they come across the Red Sea or Reed Sea, you cross that, they come to Mount Sinai. And they make a covenant with God. This agreement they reach with God, whereas the people of Israel, will come into agreement and say, we will be your people. We will follow your set of laws and rules and regulations of how to relate to you properly, how to relate to others properly, all these rules. This is what the law is. The 10 Commandments plus, do you know how many laws total there are in the Old Testament? 613. This was counted up by Jewish rabbis. They counted up every place where it said thou shalt or thou shalt not, those the do's and don'ts. 613 different rules or laws. That's what they would say. This is our covenant. These are the rules we follow. So those rules were telling you, how do you relate to God that is holy? If there's that hot spot they mentioned, how do you navigate that? How do you relate properly to that without getting killed? So this is what the rules are. Now, there are two kinds of impurities, two kinds of things that God cannot take. One is more familiar to us. This makes sense. So moral impurity is something that you and I can avoid. It's something that it's a decision, usually. It's avoidable. It is violating God's rule. God says, don't cross this line, and you do that. If there's a sign that says don't walk on the grass, you're probably going to walk on the grass. That's if you're my kids, if it says don't cross this, they'll be read everywhere. If I said don't eat your vegetables, then they're gonna do it. That's the only way I can get them to do anything, is to don't tell them not to do something. So here's where this comes from. Here's the law in Leviticus. If any one of the ordinary people among you sins unintentionally, now usually it's unintentionally because you wouldn't want to say on purpose, that's defeating everything. In doing any one of the things that by Yahweh's commandments ought not to be done. So if God says don't do this, but you do it on accident, then you incur guilt, it says. When the sin that you've committed is made known to you, you shall bring a female goat without blemish as your offering for the sin you've committed. So sin is breaking one of these rules. That makes you unclean or impure. That's the language they're going to use. So if you rob a bank, you've just broken one of the top 10. Don't steal part. You're now morally impure. That makes sense usually. That's common. This is the one I find that's more hard to get your mind around. So hang on to this for a second and pay attention here. This is important. Moral impurity is sinful. You've broken a rule. God does not want you to do that, but you've done it anyway. Ritual impurity is different. It's sometimes unavoidable. You can't help it. You're going to enter into this state of impurity, but it's not your fault. It's not sinful to be in this state. But if you go into God's presence in this state, you're in trouble. And you have to know that. So you have to know, am I pure? Am I impure? And you can't avoid, in certain cases, this condition. This is a verse that probably you've never heard a sermon on this verse before, I'm guessing, at church. I've never heard one. I don't know if Brandon's ever preached one on this or not, but when a woman has a discharge of blood, that is her regular discharge from her body, so on her period, she shall be in her impurity for 7 days. Whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. Everything upon which she lies during her impurity shall be unclean. Everything also upon which she sits shall be unclean. Notice how menstruation is something that's natural, ladies. And something that makes you unclean or impure, unable to enter into God's presence. But beyond that, notice how it's transferable. So if can I sit on this?
Yeah.
Okay. If let's say I was on my period, I'm not, so we're fine.
Right.
If I were, and I sat there and someone else came in later and sat on the same chair, that impurity would then transfer to them. And they become impure. They can't enter God's presence then either. There were all kinds of regulations like this. If a woman gives birth, in the birth story of Jesus, in Luke, they have to wait a certain amount of time before they can go and finish the rituals to get cleared for Mary. If a woman gave birth to a male child, she was impure for 40 days. If she gave birth to a female child, she's impure for 80 days, because girls are twice as yucky as boys. So that's you have to wait a certain time before. Now, it's not just menstruation that makes you impure. And again, it's not sinful. You're not wrong for being on your period. They're not saying that. Skin diseases, that the eczema would make you impure if you have skin disease or leprosy. Touching a dead body. Now you say, well, if I bury, Aunt Susie, I have to touch her back then. Yes, so you have to enter into impurity, whether you want to or not. You have to do this because you're supposed to bury the dead. And so you're entering into this impure state. Not because it's sinful, but because you have to, and therefore it's not wrong. So keep that distinction in mind. Now, why is it important to try to, as much as possible, to remain pure, to remain in a pure state and not always in your impurity? Well, there are two reasons. One of the reasons is this. At Sinai, when God's giving them this laws, he's telling them also how to build a tabernacle where God's presence was going to be in their midst, dwelling in there. He told them where they need to set up camp. So here's them camping out in the wilderness. So notice this. They have each of the tribes, so Judah, Reuben, Simeon, they're all divided up in different areas. And then around this, there's some more. This is the priest. And then in the middle is God. The the tabernacle is in their midst. This is where God's presence is dwelling with them. God says, if you remain pure, meaning I give you these rules, these laws, and you keep the laws. You say, don't do this, and you don't do that. You stay morally pure. And if ritually you go through the regulations, if you're on your period, you wait 7 days, and then you take a bath, and then you're clean. Okay. If you do that and do all that I prescribe to you, I will be near you. But here's the problem. If, let's say, all these rules I'm giving you are neglected or spurned or not followed, then in this case, God might be gone, because God literally can't be around that. He can't be around all of this impurity because he's the opposite of that. And so what you're doing by keeping purity is keeping God near you, with you, protecting you, taking care of you, around you, what you want from a God. Now, that's one thing. The other thing is this. If you continue in your impurity, it says this, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness or impurity, so that they don't die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that's in their midst. So two options, either you go or God goes. So if you're sinning by becoming morally impure, if you're ritually impure, either God's going to kill you or he's going to leave. Either way, it's not a good situation. So you want to maintain purity at all costs. And this is why it was so important for Jews to make an effort to follow those rules. All 613 rules, they would say, I'm going to try my best to keep these so that God will be with us and take care of us, and I won't be impure. And that was why these rules were followed. They were mandates that the Jews were supposed to observe at all costs. And some took this further than others. There were levels at which some Jews followed the rules, but some were so stringent, like the Essenes, the ones that were associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. That group, they were the most strict. They were the most stringent in their interpretation of how do you follow certain rules, to the point where they expanded the rules. They went beyond the rules. They added new rules. So I'll show you what I mean. So if we have a spectrum again, so from liberal, the left, to the conservatives on the right, where would you put the Pharisees? Based on your knowledge of the Gospels, where are the Pharisees?
In the middle.
In the middle? And I see, here's some right.
Somewhat conservative.
Somewhat conservative.
Not right, but.
Are they rule keepers?
All right.
Yes.
Okay. It's interesting to note when you situate the Pharisees in relation to other Jewish groups, they're kind of in the middle. And here's why. The Essenes are actually the furthest to the right. They're the most conservative of all. In fact, the Essenes had a nickname for the Pharisees. They called them liberals. They were the seekers after smooth things, meaning they took the easy way out. Which is interesting when you consider in the Gospels, the Pharisees are like the most conservative. Like they're always getting on Jesus for not keeping the rules the right way. And then the Essenes are doing the same thing to them. And they're always fighting each other in their texts. I'll give you some examples. So this is ritual impurity in the Bible. This is what the Bible says about how things transfer impurity. If this is a pure vessel, it's clean, it's pure, the water is, the bread is, everything is pure here. If a dead mouse was to fall in the water, let's say, a mouse that's dead, that's impure, okay, that then turns the bucket and the water impure. That becomes now an impure vessel. If a drop of water from the bucket then were to transfer over to the bread, that then transfers, just like transferring of the impurity here, now the food becomes impure. That's what the Bible says about impurity and transfer. Now, watch this. This is a fight that the Essenes had with the Pharisees. So we can document it in these texts that we have. They talk about it. So if this is an impure liquid over here, this is an impure vessel, impure water, something happened to it, but it's impure. If you were pouring pure liquid, like clean liquid, into this impure state, normally, what would happen, you think? It becomes impure?
Well, no,
Like going.
because if it's touched by the impure water, it becomes impure.
Okay, so you have, by touching it, it becomes impure.
I'm not. It's mixed together.
No, you're not drinking that. Either way, I need to purify here. Well, it's interesting because the Pharisees said, if it's going downstream, it's fine, right? This is going to stay pure. That's going to be impure still. But what the Essenes said, actually, these are like salmon. It travels upstream and it makes that impure. It infects upstream just as well as downstream. Now, you know, I think that's the silliest thing to argue. This was a knockdown, drag out fight of, are you serious? They were fighting about this with some serious, polemic. So that's some examples of how the Pharisees saw things versus how the Essenes saw things, but they're really strict. But beyond just how do you negotiate the rules, they went beyond that. They added rules. They added more stuff. So stuff like death, leprosy, discharges, those made you impure, and everyone agreed. They said, you know what? We need some extras. We need some extras. I said, what? You know what else makes you impure? Excrement. It sounds strange. Touching outside, being around outsiders. Those two things are, and I'm gonna deal with the excrement because that's funny. I like bathroom humor, and this is it. So I want to show you what they did with this. So Josephus is a Jewish historian who writes about the 90s AD. So he's a contemporary of some of the New Testament characters. He's writing a history of the Jews, and he talks about different groups like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. He actually says he visits the Essenes. He visited them and lived with them for a while to kind of get to know them and learn about them. Well, he tells us about them, and he says this. He says, although the easement of the body, so defecation here, defecation is natural, yet it's a rule with them, the Essenes, to wash themselves after it as if a defilement to them. Now, in your mind, you got to keep this in mind. There's no germ theory yet. So they're not thinking in terms of germs. They're not thinking in terms of they're passing on germs and you become unclean, you need to wash your hands. The defilement is ritual before God in the same way as touching a dead body is ritual before God. Menstruation, ritual. They have regulations about that, therefore. So here are some regulations in their these are straight from the text and the scrolls. This is from the War Scroll, the one about the Armageddon stuff. It says that latrine, the bathroom, has to be 2,000 cubits. Remember the cubits? 2,000 cubits outside of the camp. That was a joke somewhere. Like you can't. What is it? You're not supposed to do something where you work or where you eat. What is it? What is it? What's the joke?
You're not supposed to blank where you eat.
Blank where you eat. Okay. That's kind of the rule here. So you're living in one spot. You have to go to the bathroom way away from that spot. Because what's happening there in the bathroom is defilement, and that's okay. That's 2,000 cubits. Another text says 3,000 cubits. Now these are texts they used in their group. So whichever, that's a pretty good distance away. Here's the problem. See if you can spot it. What's the problem?
You can't walk far enough to get to the latrine.
On the Sabbath, you cannot go to the bathroom. Because you can't. You can only walk so far, and so you're going to get halfway out there and go, oh, I totally get it. And it's going to be torment. So you might want to make sure you didn't eat a big meal the night before the Sabbath. Right? This is how strict they were. So if this is, and by the way, here's Qumran again, there's the Dead Sea, Qumran settlement, there's caves. Archaeologists were wondering about this. They were like, I wonder where their bathrooms were. If we could, and they did. This rock formation here, that obviously this wasn't there, the white toilet, but there was a toilet there in behind these rocks. Now notice it's behind this big formation. They like their privacy. They actually had it was a two staller. They had two like little rock formation things where you have two little stalls as you would go. So they found the bathroom. They measured how big it's over 1,000 cubits. It's over how far they can walk. And so if this is you and you're in a scene on Sabbath, that's probably what you're gonna be doing. But it shows you the great lengths they would go to avoid breaking these rules. Now, I say all that to show you this. That's the background that we're looking at. How does this help us understand Jesus? Well, if you understand that world, that's the fights that are going on. They're fighting about, disease, or not, but ritual purity streaming upstream. And it shows you then when he says things, and he fights with others, what's he fighting about? And what is he thinking in terms of his vision of the kingdom of God compared to theirs? So what I'm going to argue is this. Throughout his ministry, Jesus displays this, compared to other Jews, a pretty radical approach towards ritual impurity. It challenges a lot of the things that many at his time were saying and doing and teaching. It challenged them directly, and it forces them to come to odds with him. So I'm going to show you. So if this is the spectrum we have, and you put Jesus on here, Jesus is actually way over here. He is, compared to them, his message is pretty radical. Now, if you ask, well, how about today? I think he would be conservative in lots of ways compared to some today, but compared to these guys, he was really liberal. He challenged what they were saying. And so I want to show you how he does this. I'm going to show you with illness and disease. And notice what I mean by how radical he is. Compare this to them. Because again, don't compare him to today, because he would look different, but back then. So the Essenes. Well, if you understand what they thought about illness and disease, Jesus is put in a different light. They thought that by meticulously observing all of these rules, even the ones we make up, we were really meticulous in observing all of them. That creates this exclusive club, if you will, exclusive approach towards illness and disease. And I want to show you what I mean. Here's some text straight from the Dead Sea Scrolls, straight from their community texts. And this is a text where it talks about what you need to do to be part of us. This is like a rule, like a guidebook for being part of us. It says this: no man who suffers from a single type of uncleanness, there's that word, that affects humanity shall enter their assemblies. That's basically us. Like, you can't come into our group if you have this. Neither is any man so afflicted to receive an assignment from the congregation. Here's the list. Here's what you can't have. No man with a physical handicap. And if that's unclear, let me explain for you. They say crippled in both legs or hands, lame, blind, deaf, dumb, or possessed of a visible blemish in his flesh, or a doddering old man unable to do his share in the congregation. Which if we haven't got you yet, then let me give a catch-all. None of those people can enter to take place in the congregation for the men of the reputation. Here's why. For the holy angels are a part of their congregation. Notice the implication here. The angels are taking part in what we're doing in our meetings. And they certainly don't want somebody who's blind or crippled. They can't take that. They don't want them, to be part of this view of God. Not only does God not like impurity, but God doesn't want you if you're that. You are, it's a really kind of it's a radical for us, I would say, a pretty terrible way of thinking about people who are the outsiders, if you will. This creates a group of outsiders. We are the insiders. Here's our wall, keep you out. So that if, let's say, the Essenes were to see this person with leprosy walk up in the street, they're going to stop. Hey, buddy, whoa, right there. That's good enough. No, not you. Sorry. But basically, I would say you can't come in. You don't come any closer to us. We don't want to be around you. Not because of germs. It's not a germ issue. It's because of unholiness, uncleanness, impurity. We are pure. We are holy. And because we're holy, us and God are buddies. We're like his angels come and be part of our choir. They're singing our choir. Like that's what they're thinking. So he is an outsider. Keep him out, and so they're out. They run from this guy. They would not be around this guy. Now, what it does then is it builds walls. It builds barriers to keep people out, the uninitiated, the ones with something wrong with them. It keeps them out and keeps them from approaching God. And that's key. Now compare that to what Jesus is doing. And notice how you get a different light is shined upon what he's doing in the Gospels when you look at it from that perspective. So what he's doing is an inclusive approach towards illness and disease. Now, imagine if Essenes were listening to this and hearing this and standing around watching what Jesus is doing. A leprous person, came to Jesus. Let's imagine he's that guy that they ran away from. Begging him and kneeling, he said to him, if you choose, you can make me clean or pure. Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. At which point, the Essenes go, oh, did you see that? He didn't know. He did not do. And he said to him, I do choose, be made clean. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. This is thrown in a completely different light. Now watch what Jesus does too. What he's doing is significant because notice how does impurity usually work? I sit on this, say somebody else before me had on this, I sit on it, I become unclean. So the impurity spreads out. I don't pass it along. I don't pass purity along to somebody else. That's God. So Jesus is claiming to be this embodiment of God's holiness so that he's able to go out and spread not impurity, but purity for people who are needing cleansing.
It really puts this kingdom of God is within you in a whole new light.
Exactly, yeah.
Because if God's in you, a part of it, then the whole idea of ritual purity is just moved.
And at Pentecost, they have these the fire, tongues of fire come on. All of them are individual temples. Like you have, they're now the temple of God. They're going out and spread. Now watch the way this works. Think about how this works in terms of the flow of traditions. So in the Old Testament, over here, back here, Old Testament traditions, you have people like Isaiah, some hints of this coming out, some purity coming out from the temple. Later on, Jesus is going to pick up these ideas. And when Jesus comes along, he's picking up older ideas of how purity works and how God's purity works. And this is going to change things. Watch the way that what he's claiming, in a way, is a fulfillment of this, but is radically different and new.
So later in the scriptures, we find this really interesting story by a prophet named Isaiah. And he has this crazy vision where he's in the temple and he's right in God's presence. He's totally terrified.
Yeah, he knows the rules. He shouldn't even be in there. and he's worried about being destroyed.
And then this crazy creature called a seraphim.
Yeah, that is a crazy creature.
Totally. So it flies over with a hot coal, and then it sears Isaiah's lips with the coal and says something really weird. Your guilt is taken away and your sin is atoned for.
So this burning coal somehow makes Isaiah pure.
Yeah, it's remarkable because normally if you touch something impure, it transfers its impurity to you. But now here's this new idea where you have this coal, this very holy and pure object, and it touches Isaiah and it transfers its purity to him. Isaiah is not destroyed by God's holiness. He's transformed by it. I mean, the implications of this are just huge. But there's one more development, this time from another prophet, Ezekiel. And he has this vision where he's standing at the temple and he sees water trickling out from it. And then that water turns into a stream, and then it grows into a deep river that starts flowing through the desert, leaving this trail of green trees behind it. And then it flows into the Dead Sea, making everything fresh and alive.
So instead of becoming pure first and then going into the temple, here God's holiness comes out from the temple, making things pure and bringing them to life. What does it all mean?
So we don't know until we meet this man, Jesus. And he claims that he's fulfilling all of these ancient visions, but in surprising new ways. So Jesus, he went around touching people who are impure, people with skin diseases, a woman with chronic bleeding, or dead people. And when he touches them, their impurity should transfer over to Jesus. But instead, Jesus' purity transfers to them and actually heals their bodies.
Jesus is like that holy coal in Isaiah's vision.
Right. And Jesus claimed that he was the human embodiment of God's own holiness, and that he and his followers were now God's temple, so that through them, God's holy presence would go out into the world and bring life and healing and hope. And so this is why Jesus described his followers as having streams of living water flowing out of them.
Right. So this puts a lot of things in new light. But notice his view of ritual purity. This is viewed as a temporary issue. It's not a permanent issue like with the Essenes. They're saying you're never going to be part of God. You're always outsiders. You can't come near God because you're this. Jesus is working to remedy this. He is radically challenging what they're claiming, what they're doing. Instead of separating from the world and saying, well, the world's broken, it's messed up. We're gonna have a meeting, guys. Let's go. Let's just huddle up in our group, keep everybody else out that's not us. Anybody that we think has a problem, they're outside. Build that wall, make sure it's big. Jesus says, no, I'm gonna fix it. I'm gonna fix what's broken. And I'm not gonna say, well, that's just damaged goods and I can't. He's working to restore the broken and fix the broken. And that's how thinking about Jesus in light of what the Essenes are doing, what the scrolls tell us, it puts him in a new light. It shows that's a pretty radical message in light of what they're saying. They would not have liked that at all. They would not have liked it at all. So, went too far. All right, that's all I've got. I've got a few more things as far as I'll show you some resources, some materials to get if you want that in a second. But I guess I'll take questions first. Yes, sir.
Is it coincidence that these rules reinforce the existing power structure?
Good point. Yes, I think absolutely. You're absolutely right. And these are the ones, again, they're kind of making up the way to reinforce. Remember how I said that they had a teacher, their leader, who said, I'm the only one that has like the key to the lock, unlock the mysteries. Nobody else can interpret these, right? I'm the guy. And so let me tell you what they mean. And he interprets them to favorably for their group. That's part of it. They use strategies like that to enforce their eliteness. And that group thought, even other Israelites, even other Jews that were, related to us by blood, they're not really part of the true group. We're the only ones, for modern language, to be saved. Or, we're the only ones that God loves. Which is a radical thing for even back then. So yes, absolutely.
Was Qumran a normal establishment, or was it like a literary? Was it a library?
It was. Well, this is debated. Let's say that this is something that scholars are working out, and some believe that it was like the headquarters of the Essene movement, because there were other Essenes that lived out around, other cities. The leading idea today is it was kind of the hub, the headquarters, where that's where the most strict ones lived. The ones who were single, they couldn't be married. There were no women. So sorry, ladies, you couldn't be part of that group. You were outsiders, and no kids. They were celibate. You have really extra strict rules for those who are living there. When you join the group, you had to give up all your possessions. So here's all my money. There you go. I give it up. And it took like almost like a whole year or more to get in the group. Like it took you a year before they let you even like partake of their food.
Talking about the Essenes?
The Essenes, right? You would, and they had this like here in their, where's that? In their banquet hall here. So they have the dining hall. If you want to be part of that group, first you had to like jump through a bunch of hoops, like show that you're worthy of this. They have to test you, and you have to answer questions. You have to get up all your stuff. Here's my wallet, my money, everything. Go through the whole process for like a year. And then after the year, we'll give you you can partake of our water. Here you go. You're good enough. You're pure enough for that. You can't touch the food yet. Another year, you go through the processes. All right, now you're worthy for the food. It took a whole lot to be part of them, and most obviously didn't. Now there were other members of the group probably that lived out in other cities that weren't as strict. They could be married, had families, had kids. They kept a lot of the rules, but not to that extent.
So it just seems like there's some commonalities between Jesus and the Essenes. And that, he was married.
Mm-hmm.
He had an apocryphal vision that the Essene spouse. He recommended recommended away everything, all your possessions. Right, so these seem like pretty Essene ideas.
Right, and this is why, especially when the first scrolls were discovered, they had this. They called him a teacher of righteousness. They don't list his name, but he's a teacher. But it talks about. It says you. How's it put? It's through faith in the teacher, but it's very Pauline, like faith in Christ kind of stuff. It's almost the exact same expression. They talk about works of the law, like Paul's talking about. So a lot of like echoes and similarities there. And so, whoa, wait a second. Is that Jesus? Because he's like leading a group and they are like almost worshiping him. And he's this leader that has a special access to God. And a lot of connections were drawn. And that's why some said this might be Jesus. Now it can't work out. There's other reasons, but it's not Jesus. But yes, there are some similarities there. But if they saw him, touching a leprosy person, they would be like, you're out of our group, buddy. And interesting enough, John the Baptist, he's baptizing just right down the road from where they're at. So some of us say maybe he's part of them too. There's all these connections that could be drawn.
Just curious, being a Jewish sect, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, was repentance part of the Essenes?
It would be. It would be.
You could get back in their graces.
To get back in their, there are really strict regulations. I'm trying to think. I don't want to tell you wrong, so I'm not going to. You can get kicked out of the group. Let's say that for falling asleep in the meeting. If you, I think, what is it? You spit on somebody. What was it? But it's like a really nitpicky, like, are you serious kind of thing? But they could kick you out, and it would take a whole lot, like go through the whole process again to get back in. But it was. I don't want to tell you wrong. So, but just know that you could lose it easily, but you got to go through a whole lot of hoops to get back in and to get in general. And like they had, there was found among the scrolls a list like of people who got in trouble and what they did. Like, so-and-so got reprimanded, like called out in the group because I forgot what they did. But they've done something. And it was minor. It's like, so minor. Are you serious? They think they fell asleep in the meeting. And so that was it. That you get wrote up for that. But it's just so funny to see that real life lived kind of experience they have.
Kind of technical question. Kind of explain why there's so many ritual baths in the settlement. But if the vessel and the water become unclean, then, in that sense, instead of going the other way around.
I'll mention that. Thank you for raising that question. This is like one of, I don't know, 7, I can't remember how many there are total, but there are a bunch of ritual baths, big 5 at Qumran. If you've never seen one of those, it's kind of like if you've ever seen a Baptist church where they have baptistry, where you walk down the steps and you're baptized, into the water. It's kind of like that. They had I don't have a picture with me, but they had a setup so that they had steps. You walk down the steps one way, and it has a partition, by the way. It's like one side. You walk down the water. Now the water you didn't fill it up. Like you get your hose out. It was rainwater that it had collected. And so it was disgusting. You imagine rainwater collecting in a big barrel. And that's what you walk down into. They would disrobe, so they would take their clothes off. And they did this a couple times a day, probably. You would walk down in the water, completely immerse yourself, go under, and you turn around, you walk back up the other side. You're not cleaner. You definitely got probably dirt and leaves and gross stuff. The water is disgusting, but it's clean because it's not, what's the word? It's not man-made, like it's not manipulated in any way. It had to come from nature, but that made it pure and okay. And so that's how they viewed it. Even it's just disgusting to think about how that worked. But they would do that a couple times a day. You have to do that, wash your impurity off before you eat, after you go to the bathroom, so forth.
So in Matthew, Jesus said, I come to fulfill the law. And they're pretty certain when you translate that from Aramaic or whatever, he's not referring to laws of purity.
Laws of purity. Short answer. Well, it's kind of hard to get into the short answer. It's okay. Here's the thing. So early Christians, early Jesus followers, they fought about what does a Gentile need to do, non-Jew need to do to fully part of the community. Some, like Paul, said, no, you don't have to keep these rules. These rules, the purity stuff, the food, those aren't things that you need to do to keep as a Gentile to be part of us. You get in by faith. Jesus' brother, James, seems to have said the opposite. He says, you better keep these rules and be circumcised. So you basically convert to Judaism to be part of us, because Jesus is Jewish and so are you. So there's that debate. Well, most read Matthew as more on James's side. So Matthew is a very Jewish, he's advocating keeping the law, the rules. Jesus doesn't say get rid of the rules. Mark does, but Matthew does not. And Jesus says, you've heard it said in the Old Testament, don't commit adultery. What does Jesus say?
Don't lust in your heart.
Don't even lust in your heart. Don't even think about it. That's not saying the rules are gone. That's saying I'm like raising the bar. It's even harder to do. And so Matthew seems to present a Jesus that's keeping the rules and actually showing his followers how to keep the rules in a even more strict way. So
that's an ethical rule.
Right. Right. The ritual. Well, in Matthew, there's even some like ritual rules, like when Jesus says, don't, when you go to the temple for a sacrifice and you remember your brother has something against you, leave it there and then go make up with him and then come back. Is that saying that he expected him to still sacrifice? That's an interesting, question, but Matthew has it. Mark leaves that kind of thing out. And so Mark's more Paul. He's like Paul. So Mark has like a thing where it says, the Pharisees are all over Jesus, and he's saying, they're telling him, why don't you wash your hands before you eat? Why aren't you following our rules? And he says, I don't follow your rules. It's not what goes into the body that matters, makes you impure, is what comes out of the heart. And then Mark makes a little addition there. He says, by saying this, Jesus makes all food clean. Basically, you can eat what you want to now. Mark is more on that Paul side of those rules are, here are those rules. Matthew's a little bit different. So that's the best I can do as far as, that goes, what Jesus was. Somebody else had a question. I'm sorry. Thought. Let me this last thing. Let me say this. I'm going to give you some resources. Hopefully. One is this. If you want to know about, if you want to actually look at the scrolls, you say, that's a cool picture. I want to see them for myself. You can. They're all online now. There's no more conspiracy. There's no more hiding. They're all out. They're digital. They're free online. This is the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls collection. Here's the website at the bottom. But this is, you can look at all the scrolls. They're really good photographs, really good pictures, digital pictures that you can look at. They're listed by like biblical text, non-biblical text, and so forth. That's a resource. I also wanted to show you something else. Let's see. I have some books down here. And let's go. So I have a couple of books. If you want to look at them later, you can. I'll show you what they are. So this is like the standard English translation. So if you say, I want to read some of these are interesting. This is a place you can go. It's a Penguin Classic, so it's not very expensive, $7, $8. This is the 7th edition. The guy that's translating this is one of the best. He's dead now, but he was one of the best in the world at these scrolls. But this is the standard translation that most people today use. It has all the scrolls except the biblical scrolls. So you won't get the Isaiah, the Genesis. There's another separate volume for that has those in it, or you can use the online thing I showed you earlier. So that's a translation. This is a basic introduction, similar to what we just did, but with lots more. This is the book I use in class. I teach a class on this at Tusculum. I think next year I'll teach that class, next fall. But it's a whole class in the scrolls. This is what I use at the textbook. It contains everything from the story of how they were discovered, what's in the scrolls, the group, the rules, all of that. It's everything you want to know. But notice it's not too big. It's not intimidating at all. Pretty good size. That's a good resource to use. And let's see. Lastly, if you want to know about the story, here's the full history. This is actually volume 1. Volume 2 isn't out yet, but this is volume 1 of the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It tells about the discovery, like who discovered. He actually interviews the Bedouin, the shepherds. Tell me about your story. He gives them, interesting details. The guy who bought them, the first scholar who had them, he tells all about his story, how they became, actually, there's interesting stories behind this too. Some of the scrolls got smuggled into the U.S. and they were sold. You want to guess where they sold them at?
New York.
New York. Well, they put an advertisement out, actually. Where was the advertisement put out? What? You say eBay? They put it in the Wall Street Journal. Advertisement. Dead Sea Scrolls for sale. It's part of the intrigue. That's the full story of that. It's a really good one. It's more expensive though. The other two are not expensive. I also have sheets if you want to get one of these. And if you don't have enough, we can make copies of these. This is resources. So what I have are, there's a course from the Great Courses. I gave you the information on it. I think it's between like 35 and 200, depending on when you like the special they're running. It's a very good course. There's another kind of course that's free that you can get on here. There's a bunch of videos that you can get on YouTube for free. So resources that might be helpful for you. If I mentioned, I teach a whole course on this. So we discuss all the things we just discussed, plus many more things in the course. I have all those resources in electronic form. So they're all recordings, like 30-minute little recordings with the PowerPoints, with the discussion of everything. If anyone would like that, I know that you probably don't want to come to Greenville and take a class. If you did, you're more than welcome to do that. If you would like to do that and audit the class. But if anyone would like those lectures, I would be glad to share them with you for free. I would just need a way to get them to you somehow. I don't know how to maybe put them on a Dropbox somehow, but the files are huge because these are huge. So they're big files, and I can't just like send them to you by email. So, but if you want to do that, I can get your information and we can work out something to get that to you if you ever want that. So, any questions about resources or anything? Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
If anybody wants the resources, there you go.
Yeah, we don't take one.
If you look at the differences that you can see from the volumes of.
Really quick, folks,
And they were worried about.
can I get everybody's attention before you leave for just a second, please? First, we want to say thank you again, on behalf of the church. We are so grateful for your time. If you are a First Pres person, we need your help. We've got a memorial service here in a couple hours and we need to kind of get this room ready for reception afterwards. Right here is the person who can give you a job. Please, if you can stick around for a few minutes and help, we would be so grateful for that. Just come see Mel for an assignment. Travis, thank you. And thank you all for coming. We are so delighted to have you here.
Glad to be here.
How do we go from that period of 200 to whatever?
Did well. Yeah. And so that was really my goal. So, yeah.
That was wonderful.
It was. Yeah.
But big job now is you've gone. All history doesn't mean anything to
Right.
And the story is preserved. The story, not the word. So how do they reconcile that with those?
Well, one of the things I've found is I grew up in fundamentalism where we were, where, it was really